Chapter 0, 11 a.m., 26th of December, 1977. I was going to stick it out, and do it cold this time. No drugs to alleviate the symptoms of withdrawal. I had spent a sleepless night, sweating and shivering. Maybe I had slept, and was now dreaming that I hadn't slept, in which case I must be asleep. I turned over, thumped the pillow into shape, and tried to relax. My toes and shins were numb. I tried to check for sensation, first with one foot against the other, then with trembling hands. The harder I tried to steady my hands, the more uncontrollable they became. You'll be all right if you just stay in bed. You don't have to do anything today. You don't have to see anybody, talk to anybody, eat anything or drink anything. Just stay in bed and see it through. It didn't matter if I hadn't slept all night. I could sleep all day. And even if I couldn't sleep today, I would spend a whole week in bed if necessary. That's what I'd do. I felt better. Sat up, reached out for my pipe, picked it up from the ashtray. That was good. I was doing well. I picked up a box of matches, opened it. My hands were only shaking slightly. I lit my pipe, shook the match to put it out and tried to blow it out, dropped my pipe, threw the match into the ashtray and watched it burn out. I picked up my pipe and tried to put it in the ashtray and missed by a couple of inches, knocking the ashtray onto the floor. Forget about the pipe and the ashtray. Nothing's burning. Leave them. I relaxed back onto my pillow, but dodged suddenly as an angle-poised lamp prepared to attack me, but then didn't. It stayed where it was. The terrible itching started again. I remembered now. That was what had been keeping me awake. There were insects all over me. In the hall outside, I could hear the clock, the soft, comforting, regular tock. There was no tick. The clock was just saying, tock. I listened hard for the tick. It wasn't there, and of course I knew why. I had become so infuriated at the regularity of its thumping message, not tick-tock, but breeze-block, breeze-block, breeze-block. I'd even tried to change it to teapot, teapot, that I had carried the clock into another room, covered it with pillows, and gone back to bed, closing both doors. That was why I could only hear the soft, distant tock, 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 tick-tock, 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 breeze-block, breeze-block. Oh, Christ, leave me alone. I buried my head in the pillows. I could hear nothing. I listened hard. Nothing. Except the distant breeze-block, breeze-block. I sat up. The bedroom door was open. The clock still on the landing. I remembered bumping into it as I lurched past it after throwing up the last time. And the pillows, they were still on the bed. It must have been a dream, so I had slept. Right then. I'll get up and go downstairs and just spend the rest of the day watching television. There's going to be no one around except John, David, and Batch. They've all seen me with the shakes before, and I've told everyone else that I'll be away for Christmas. When you're not sure whether you're going to throw up or not, the last thing you need is someone fussing. Are you all right? You look a bit pale. Would you like a nice cup of tea and perhaps a thin slice of toast with a poached egg on top? I was about to make the decision to get out of bed when David came in and asked me how I was. And was there anything I wanted, like a nice... No, I snapped. But the words for the rest of the sentence, though formed in my head, just would not articulate themselves. I'll just leave moment later. Get up, be fine. Vichy water? No, yes. He plumped up the duvet. I flinched. It was out to get me, in league with the clock and the table lamp and the pipe and the ashtray and the matches. You just stay there, he said, and very sensibly left the room. David, curtains, light. The curtains were still drawn, but there was a chink at the top through which a laser beam from the outside world was threatening me. Oh, fuck all this. You'll be all right. Pull yourself together, man. Get dressed. I threw off the stifling duvet and sat up with my feet on the floor. I slowly dressed, clutching onto anything that I could find for support, lurching around the room. I drew the curtains and felt better. Nothing in the room was moving except for me. I picked up my pipe and lit it. This simple, for me, automatic action gave me confidence. I composed myself. Usually, about half an hour after getting up in the morning, if I hadn't managed to down at least 5 measures of gin, there would be the coughing fit accompanied by the dry heaves, the coughing, the cold sweat, the uncontrollable shivering. But it was 11:30. Perhaps I'd stayed in bed long enough to miss out this daily genuflection and regurgitative prayer to the lavatory bowl. The bedroom doorpost took a swipe at me as I walked past, a mild hallucination. I steadied myself for my walk down the stairs, stairs which I knew either stopped before I finished going down them or carried on after I'd stopped, with banisters that were never quite in the same place, corner posts that made sudden lunges at me, hoping that I would lose concentration and bang my head on shadows. But I was too quick for the shadows and ducked, only to walk straight into a right-hand uppercut from the corner post which had got round me with its clever footwork. Back to bed. 44 hours of febrile paranoia and auditory and tactile hallucinations followed in that restless bed. Sheer exhaustion won, and I slept for a few hours. And I knew that I'd slept this time. I'd sweated it out. The worst was over. Even the stairs had suspended hostilities. I managed to drink a cup of tea, keep down some vitamin pills, and a slice of toast with a poached egg on it. I was free. I went into the dining room, quite calmly walked past 3 shelves of Christmas booze, and rang Bernard and Jane, my secretary, to ask them round for a drink. Provided, I added smugly, they could stand the sight of me drinking tonic water. They came round to the house. I poured them a drink, while apologizing for slightly trembling hands. They were both pleased that I'd recovered so quickly, and as I poured myself a neat, slimline tonic, I explained to them how much more confident I was of staying off alcohol for good now that I'd done it the hard way. As I picked up my drink, I knocked over a Christmas card. I put my glass down and tried to stand the Christmas card up again. My fingers wouldn't keep still. "Don't bother about that," said Bernard. "Sit down." I was bothered about it. It was the only thing that mattered. I had to stand that Christmas card up. The harder I tried, the worse I shook. "I'm all right." The shaking was now a rhythmic shuddering, which turned into a sudden spasm, and I fell to the ground, taking with me a pile of glasses, bottles, and Bernard. I woke up to flashing blue lights. There was an ambulance outside. What was that doing there? I felt fine. I'd had worse cuts. Everyone persuaded me that perhaps hospital was the best thing. Jane was gaping as though she'd just been witness to an exorcism. I was carried off to the hospital knowing that I'd lost my heroic struggle with the distilleries of the world. Perhaps 2 bottles of gin a day was hitting the stuff a bit hard. Bernard later pointed out to me that over the last 6 months, because I'd been buying in bulk, I had moved on to the pub-size bottles, that is, 40 fluid ounces each, making an average daily consumption of 4 pints imperial, 2.5 US quarts. It was enough to preserve a cadaver or kill 6 encrotites. St. Alvar's Hospital probably had some well-equipped and modern wards, and parts of it may well be the very best in the land, but I was taken to none of these bits. I was destined for the national health as it really is parts of the edifice of healing. Dingy corridors, overcrowded wards, underworked staff, Hogarthian inmates, Boadicea plumbing, and a television that you had to peddle. Quantities of blood were taken for analysis. I was pumped full of vitamins and drugged up to my toupee with heminevrin and Valium. But the Rasputin in me cut through the fog of sedation like a bottle of cutty sark. I knew that I was not living in the style to which I'd been accustomed, and decided that those who could pay for medicine should. I was taken to a private clinic, in which there was, luckily, 1 Arab-free bed. My personal physician and hard-drinking companion, His Efficaciousness, A.R. Bailey, the practical, member of the Royal College of Physicians, said, "Right, we'll start the treatment. Your liver function tests were appalling, 10 times over the acceptable norm for the gamma-GTP, for instance. But there's no sign of enlargement, and with a bit of luck there's a chance that you may not have damaged your liver permanently. We'll phase out the heminevrin and Valium gradually, and you can take 1 Abstem tablet in the morning and 1 in the evening, so that if you do drink any alcohol, you'll feel as ill as you were 5 days ago. It's up to you whether you drink or not. It's your liver. It's your life." Dr. Bailey left me Valiumed up a treat, along with the children, whose little faces shone with anticipation as in came Puss, followed by Dick Whittington. "Oh dear, Puss," said Dick, "London is far behind us. What shall we do now?" "Meow." "What's that? Sing a song?" "Meow." "What now? For all the children?" "Meow." "Shall we sing a song, children?" "Yes." The words were lowered from the ceiling, and as the band struck up the March of the Liberty Bell, we all joined in the song. "Of all the organs the body contains, the liver's the one for me. It processes food, it deals with the waste, it's cleverer than a knee. When it throws up its hands at alcohol and makes you extremely ill, it's best to take heed, you're not being a weed, you're just being sensible." "Dizzy Gillespie wrote that," I said. "He may have done, but Fenchurch Street Station is mine. So, Jane, that's £150 you owe me," said Bernard. "You've only got 2 stations," said Jane. "I bought Marylebone from you last time you landed on Graham's Hotel in Old Kent Road." Oh, well, that's me out then. No, it isn't. There's still plenty of property you can mortgage. I'm not going to mortgage those. I'm going to build there. You haven't got any money. All right, I'll give you the waterworks. I don't want it. Perhaps Graham does. Graham, do you want the waterworks? Graham? No, I'll buy the camelopard. What? It's a camel that looks like a leopard. A giraffe. He's gone again, said Bernard. A pantomime. Dizzy Gillespie, camelopard. I was clearly making a good recovery. Even without alcohol, I was thinking irrationally. And generally being an odd sort of fellow, don't you know? What ho, old chap? How's the gazebo? Do you know, last time I was in Paris, I really did ring Jean-Paul Sartre, and Simone de Beauvoir answered the phone and said that he was out distributing leaflets. Or was that a sketch? Leaving that side of my mind to play around with itself for a while, the rest of it brought itself up to date. I was feeling good. My self-imposed treatment was over. With the use of alcohol, I had managed to kill exactly the number of brain cells I had decided to lose at the age of 22 without sacrificing my liver. There's no doubt that an excess of alcohol accelerates the death of brain cells, and that in small doses, as with any other anesthetic, it can temporarily put them out of action, starting at the top and working down the central nervous system. It's the inhibitory influences of the higher centers of the brain which are first affected. That's why alcohol is so commonly used as an aid to social intercourse. It can help you say hello to new friends, goodbye to old friends. Do you want to come back to my place to strangers? Or why don't you fuck off to tediosities? If you're on to assert, the last thing you need is something nagging away at the front of your brain saying, perhaps another time, with someone else. Anyway, might laugh at my Willie. What you need is another pint. To cure my own inhibitions, however, I had discovered a long time ago that another pint and then another was not enough. I was interested in something more permanent. I needed to rid myself of my cramping fetters forever. I had prescribed an extensive course of heavy drinking in order to actually kill off offending nerve cells, a hazardous treatment in that some of the more useful cells, those responsible for keeping oneself within the limits of socially acceptable behavior, also received a heavy battering. So, what could have been the story of a kind-hearted, respectable medical practitioner isn't. Chapter 1. Perinatal Developments and a Few Other Bits. I was born in Leamington, now officially known as Royal Leamington Spa, moderately famous for the manufacture of gas cookers. The year was 1942, and the period of gestation ended on the 7th of February during a rather botched-up air raid in which the Germans thought they were hitting Coventry. My parents, Tim and Betty, were outraged when I arrived because they'd been expecting a heterosexual black Jew with several rather amusing birth deformities as they needed the problems. They lived in an enormous Gothic castle in the south of France called Dum Drinking Gin and Slimline Tonic with Ice but No Lemon in, which was originally built by Marco Polo for himself and a few friends he wanted to invite round to his place after the pub closed. An awe-inspiring construction of granite and bits of wood, with sweeping lawns recently modified to include an ornamental malaria swamp. He felt a sharp stab of steel in his groin and the sickening sensation of the warm ooze of blood welling up inside his flying jacket. A screaming hail of bullets punched through his left ear as he mused, "Hey, that was my ear." Thinking this over, he continued to massage the coconut milk into her firm, young breasts. He took another mouthful, letting it dribble slowly onto the tip of each erect nipple, and watched it stream tantalizing down towards the moistly quivering lips of her French poodle Kipper. I must admit, so far, that Chapter 1 has not had much more than a grain of truth in it, but it is more interesting than all the usual humdrum wetting of nappies and later pants and not being allowed to sit next to Lottie, the Czechoslovakian girl, because I once shat myself, seeing bits of people hanging from trees. Oh, that does sound interesting. Perhaps I should put that down. Where was I? Yes, I was 3 at the time, and my mother wanted to take me along to see my father, being a policeman, which is something he did most days. A street in Wigston Magna, 1944. There has just been an explosion in an aircraft in which 9 free Polish airmen had been flying. The force of the explosion has reduced them to their component parts, and one can see quite clearly a lung hanging down from the lower branches of a chestnut tree, a leg on a front lawn, and a hole in the roof of a semi-detached, which was later explained by a lady who came out of the house carrying a bucket with what looked like a liver in it. The 3-year-old boy is not particularly worried because he's holding his mummy's hand, and his daddy is in charge, and being very efficient about trying to sort out bits of human flesh into at least 9 different sacks. Unfortunately, there seem to be only 8 heads and no other suspicious roof holes. Mummy calls out to Daddy, "Walter!" "Sorry, dear, I'm busy." "Hey, you, that sack's already got 2 legs in it." Reflecting on this, I go, "Wah!" inwardly, and I'm just thinking of going, "Wah!" outwardly when my mother grabs my hand. "Walter, dear, we were just going out shopping, and I thought that Graham might like—" "Look, dear, I'll see you later. Has anyone found that head yet? Hey, has anyone in this street found a head? Come on, someone must have it. I know this street. You'd whip anything. I mean, what the bloody hell are you going to do with a head?" "Well, dear, perhaps we'll go and get your tea." "What?" "Oh, yes. Egg on toast, please. Left arm here. Anyone missing a left arm?" "We haven't got any eggs. There's a war on." "Ask Harold. Something's bound to have fallen off the back of a lorry." "All right, dear. Come on, Graham. Stop staring at all that blood. It won't do you any good." "Oh, come on, Mum. This must be one of my major formative experiences." Ah! And so, London, 1895. Oscar Wilde's residence. In the glittering drawing-room are gathered a glittering group. The cream of London society, the Prince of Wales, James McNeill Whistler, George Bernard Shaw, and Wilde himself are just a few of the notables present. Inevitably, it is Oscar Wilde the party centres around. Raising his glass of champagne, the Prince speaks to his host. "My congratulations, Wilde. Your play is a great success. The whole of London is talking about you." The group waits expectantly for the master of the paradox to be paradoxical. Wilde does not disappoint them. "There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about." For a full minute, the laughter reverberates around the room. Whistler turns puce with envy. Shaw twitches with jealousy. Aubrey Beardsley micturates in pique. Max Beerbohm stuffs a sour grape up his nostril, and Jane Austen revolves in her grave. The Prince claps Oscar on the shoulder. "Very witty, very witty." The game is afoot. Whistler takes a breath and riposts. "There is only one thing worse in the world than being witty, and that is not being witty." It is a hit. The room rocks with laughter for another full minute. Oscar Wilde's face goes as green as his carnation. Shaw winces. Beardsley, feeling a pang of resentment, defecates in a riding boot. Beerbohm enviously punches a hole in a Chinese silk screen, and Jane Austen's false breast falls off. Wilde opines, "I wish I had said that." Whistler smiles at him. He had expected that incisive retort and is ready for it. "You will, Oscar, you will." Wilde waves an effete hand in the direction of Whistler. "Your Highness, do you know James McNeill Whistler?" Ducking the effete hand, the Prince declares, "Yes, we play squash together." Wilde is in like a rapier. "There is only one thing worse than playing squash together, and that is playing it by yourself." He waits expectantly for the roars of laughter and the shrieks of glee. They do not come. The silence grows longer. So does Shaw's beard. Eventually, Oscar mutters, "I wish I hadn't said that." Seeing his bosom friend with egg on his face, Whistler cannot resist the temptation to throw an omelette. "You did, Oscar, you did." The room rocks with laughter. Exhausted with the excellence of the wit and the gay bonhomie, the Prince bids his host farewell. "You must forgive me, Wilde, but I must get back up the palace." Wilde is desperate. It's unheard of. The Prince of Wales leaving with a smile on his face that had not been put there by Oscar Wilde. He blurts, "Your Majesty, you are like a big jam donut with cream on top." A shocked hush descends on the room. The Prince of Wales, like his mother on a previous occasion, is not amused. "I beg your pardon." Wilde splutters, completely at a loss. It was one of Whistler's." The game is now not merely afoot, it's putting the boot in. "I didn't say that." "You did, James, you did." The Prince of Wales and the assembled company gaze expectantly at Whistler. For a moment, the celebrated painter is at a loss. Then, "I meant that, like a donut, your arrival gives us pleasure, and your departure makes us hungry for more." Loud laughter and applause follow this elegant explanation. Encouraged, Whistler moves on to the attack. "Your Majesty is like a stream of bat's piss." Over the gasps, the Prince of Wales thunders, "I beg your pardon?" Coolly, the painter gazes at the Prince. "It was one of Wilde's." How will the hero of 1,000 cul-de-sacs cope with this one? The gathering does not have to wait long for an answer. The mind that has been sharpened to a sword's edge through years of verbal fencing rises brilliantly to the occasion. It sodding well wasn't. It was one of Shaw's. Bernard Shaw totters visibly as the buck that has been passed him hangs heavily round his neck. But this is the man destined to write Arms and the Man, and its astonishing sequel, Armpits and the Woman. Smiling at the prince, he speaks softly, "I merely meant, your majesty, that you shine out like a shaft of gold when all around is dark." There's a ripple of awed admiration. The ease with which Shaw had escaped from the sinking ship has been remarkable. Shaw has been put on his mettle by a fellow Irishman, and to Shaw a fellow Irishman is fair game. He gives Wilde a wicked look, and then coolly drops the doyen of distinguished society in the ordure. "Your Majesty is like a dose of clap." There is a collective gasp of horror. The horror becomes near panic when Shaw, not waiting for the prince's superb rejoinder of "I beg your pardon," continues, "Before you arrive is pleasure, but after a pain in the dong." The Prince of Wales pales in anger, and there is a lot of him. There is a lot of pale. "What?" he shrieks. Then Shaw plays his MasterCard. "It was one of Wilde's." Every eye in the room looks at Oscar Wilde, including the bloodshot pair belonging to the Prince of Wales. "I'm waiting, Wilde, I'm waiting." New York, 1976, the City Center Theatre, a packed house. Monty Python's Flying Circus is appearing. We are in mid-sketch. Whistler is being played by John Cleese. Shaw is being played by Michael Palin. The Prince of Wales is being played by Terry Jones. I am playing Oscar Wilde. And I have just dried. I cannot remember the next line. The entire theatre waits. And as they wait, so do I, for that damned line to enter my head. It refuses to come. I am beginning to break out into a sweat. The line just won't come. John Cleese shuffles uncomfortably and mutters, "Get on with it." Thinking this is a prompt, I proclaim loudly, "Get on with it." The reaction of the audience gives me the definite impression this is not my line. It's at moments like this when one thinks, "Oh, fuck it, does it really matter? What are we all here for? Are we predestined to take the paths we follow?" And sure enough, as though to prove a point, I was actually in Los Angeles a year later. We extinguished our cigarettes and fastened our seat belts, and then did it again in French and Spanish, as the first-class lounge of the mighty British Airways Boeing 747 banked sharply to the left. Captain Chet Bigglesberg's crisp Oxford drawl slid powerfully through the intercom. "Listen, y'all, how are y'all? Anyway, jolly good. We'll all be, like, sort of landing and things in sort of your, Los Angeles in approximately sort of 15 minutes from this point-style moment in time, instance-wise, y'all. That is to say, landingization will be completed sort of, in a bit, as of now, y'all. Toodle-pip, sort of what? How? Click. Frightfully sorry, y'all. Click. The enormous bar glid to a halt, and I and my financial adviser, Major Sloane, were ushered from our divans by the now nude Cypriot debutante air hostess. She offered us our disembarkation executive foot modules, vinylized nylonette uppers, hand-stitched onto personalized red carpetlet soles, a touching modern reminder of a never-existent old-world charm. In our 64-foot, four-seater Cadillac, we executived off downtown for the premiere of Muhammad Ali's film, The Greatest, an excellent movie, a damn sight better than Jaws or Saturday Night Fever, which was rejected by black and white audiences alike for simply telling the truth. Or could the distributors have found its portrayal of parasitical white middlemen uncomfortably astute? The select open-air reception afterwards at the vast Plaza de los Reganos drew a huge crowd of spectators, all eager to see the champ arrive stylishly by helicopter. All eyes gazed heavenwards as Muhammad Ali, in a typically flamboyant gesture, walked quietly in from the back and mingled with the guests. He was soon spotted by hordes of film, television, and press cameramen who would have made personal contact impossible had he not politely ignored them. Like any decent actor, he simply wanted to know how the film had gone. As at all film premieres, most people were standing around trying to look as though they knew the star so well that they didn't even need to acknowledge his presence, and merely peered around, wondering whether anyone had noticed them. 5 people were so famous they didn't even need to turn up, and their vacant spaces were stared at with awe. There was going to be Sammy Davis Jr., and over there would have been Frank Sinatra, if his trichologist hadn't ordered him to sit at home in a chair. The other boxing aficionados were so indescribably famous they had to hire 3 separate stadiums to be absent at. I have never seen so much awe. I left them all to it, and congratulated the man himself on a great performance. He knew that I meant what I had said, and we sat down and chatted for 20 minutes. I found him kind, perceptive, and wise, and unlike some who pass for intelligent, capable of listening to others. He must have seen something in me, too, otherwise I wouldn't have lasted a full 20 minutes. We talked about religion, black and gay liberation, and the fear that drives man to destroy man. Certainly one of the most fascinating conversations in my life. But the gin that had given me the courage to talk to him in the first place also made me completely forget everything that we said. What a wasted opportunity. Sorry, everybody, but Major Sloane is trying to arrange a return bout on more equal terms now that I'm back in training. I thanked the greatest, we shook hands, and I walked back into the crowd. My head was buzzing. Everything went beige with little patches of russet, and I was aware of a sensation of violent speed as I was crushed by gigantic G-forces against the granite steps of the David Niven Memorial, which seemed to be hurtling out into the black abyss of space. This is no time for musing, I mused. Suddenly it seemed that a hole had been torn in the very fabric of space. Was I being sucked into a black hole rent in the great donut of eternity? Don't be silly, I thought. Of course you are. It was almost as if I was being drawn along a powerful tractor beam towards some unearthly giant starship. As luck would have it, I was. Well, this is a turn-up, I said to myself, thinking, what a strange thing to say. It must have been my upbringing which brought about my following action, for at moments of great stress, I always think of people hanging in trees. I threw up. Small bits of tomato skin, sweet corn husks, and diced carrot moved out into an elliptical orbit around the sun. There before me was an immense cylindrical structure, oblate in cross-section, 9.2 kilometers long, 1.92 kilometers across its longer elliptical axis, and 1.56 kilometers down its shorter elliptical axis. Its further end seemed to be glowing with an eerie incandescent power, and the brown, fluted, longitudinal striations made it look for all the world like a lighted Peter Stuyvesant that had just been gently sat on by someone wearing slightly damp corduroy trousers, but twice as sinister. The force beam in which I was trapped was still drawing me and the minuscule portion of what had once been Los Angeles into an entrance bay in what would have been the middle section of a filter tip, if it had actually been a cigarette as described and not a bloody great spaceship. As usual in these situations, I now lost consciousness, being overcome with horror at the thought of all the descriptive detail that would otherwise have been needed. Everything went black. Absolutely everything. I couldn't see a damn thing but utter blackness, until suddenly I woke up out of my extremely well-thought-out insensibility and found myself on the bridge of the starship, which, as luck would have it, was completely indescribable. I slowly became aware of a strange group of totally unimaginable, my luck was still holding, creatures crowded round a cluster of scanning screens. To my astonishment, I saw that they were watching fictional reruns from my encounter with puberty, what we doctors refer to as Chapter 2. Chapter 2, Eton. Summer term, or WOPS as we called it, seemed to have dragged on endlessly. I sat there in a faded deck chair, gazing dreamily at the shimmering greensward which I'd come to know so well. Clop came the sound of Clement Attlee Jr. hitting another 4. Though only a Prime Minister's son, he'd managed to fit in quite well with some of the other boys and was regarded as simply Ozzard by the senior co-pre. I suppose that was because he never got wazzed. Footnote, wazzed. Old Salopian for being afraid. See Robert Graves' The Greek Myths. Although he had gronked most of the lower school with his tadger. Clop, yet another 4. I thought of Horace. Jam Victoria tam facilis scrotum non valet. We always beat Harrow anyway. Why bother? I stood up with languid ease. A junior tick came up and, tugging at my flannels, grovelled. "Oh, Chapman, sir, may I clean your teeth tonight? Oh, please." "Why don't you bugger off, Shagspot?" I replied traditionally, and gave him a sharp clip on the temple with my bat. "Thank you, sir," he sobbed, and traditionally slumped to the ground. Plucky little squit, that young Macmillan. Should go far, I thought. The sun dappled through the copper-tinted leaves of the beeches along Big Wall,
as I walked back. Lower Downers seemed strangely calm in that light. Far from the sweltering pitch, it stood like an oasis in its granite vastness. The air was still, save for the drone of a distant one-seater. Where was it travelling from? Where to? Did it matter? The smell of freshly mown grass wafted over from far-off Hayes Meadow. The village clock chimed in the distance, and somewhere, miles above our petty earth, a wisp of cloud took flame from the dying embers of the setting sun. They combined to produce an atmosphere so redolent of this type of writing. A faint clop in the distance splintered the fabric of my meditations, a crass intrusion. What the hell, I thought. Just for that, I shall bloody well bogle up Millclap Passage, and if I meet the captain of Montem collecting salt, or some other lobsters bartering in the forecast, I shan't give an Oppidan's fart. I cycled past rows of parental Rolls-Royces and cheap-looking Bentleys, lower-middle Daimlers and Cadillacs, NQOC, footnote, not quite our class. In a few days, I would be in Nice, soaking up the sun at the side of my father's pool, while Jenkins hovered by with a tray of vodka-tinis. Someone shouted, "Hey, look where you're going!" I looked round to see who it was, and clop! Everything went beige, with purple bits round the edges. The acrid smell of burning rubber, a stabbing pain in my shoulder, mists swirling before my eyes, and the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore suddenly stopped. "Would you like another sandwich, dear?" "What?" "They're your favourite sandwich spread." So this is Nice? I look round. Can it be Nice? We are sitting in our Ford Anglia, my father, my mother, and myself on the promenade, and all we can see is rain, grey sky, grey sea, and grey waves crashing over a grey sea wall. "What do you mean, Nice? This is Scarborough." "You do too much reading," says my father. My mother agrees. "It'll do you more good if you eat your tea." "Quite right. You can't get through to him when he's got a book in his hands. What is it, anyway?" "I haven't been reading." "What's that, then?" My father leans over and glances at a few lines of a paperback that lies open in my hands. Unfortunately, he chooses a paragraph in which two centurions are caressing each other in bed. That sort of thing quite obviously did not go down well with the police force in those days. I wobble a little and close the book. It's a history book." "It's a funny sort of history book. Put it away." "What, dear?" my mother asked. "Nothing, dear. Put it away, Graham. Don't let your mother see it." "What is it?" she insists. I turn to her and explain. "It's called Claudius the God by Robert Graves, a fine historical reconstruction of the life of Claudius, the Republican Roman Emperor, thought of in his time as a pitiful fool, though the reign Mr. Graves describes is far from folly." "Is it?" Says my father, as he locks the book in the glove compartment. Graves. Wasn't he born in Wimbledon?" asked my mother. "No, that was Tim Graves." "No, it wasn't. You remember the Graves? There was Alf, and he married that Amelia von Rank, the bonny woman. They used to live above the chemist in Thurbid Street, opposite the Gantlets. I never did like the Gantlets, that smelly corgis of theirs. They should have had it put down." "They should. Pitiful. Its back legs didn't work. Anyway, finish your tea. We ought to go and get that haddock for Mrs. Rich's. There's plenty of time for that later on. Thraxted's doesn't close till 5. They're bound to be out of haddock by then." "We'll get halibut." "Mrs. Rich's especially asked for haddock." "Haddock, halibut, cod, there's no difference, all fish. Let's just sit here for a bit and enjoy the view." "It's raining," I say. "It's bracing. You should have your window open, lad. Get a bit of ozone into your lungs." Ozone is oxygen in a condensed state having 3 atoms to the molecule, O3. What you can smell is rotting seaweed. "Well, it's good for you." "No, it isn't. Don't argue with your father." "It's those fancy books he's been reading. You can't learn everything out of books, my lad." "There's no argument. It's a fact." "Stop it, Graham. Come on, we'll go and get the fish." "No, we won't. We'll stay here. Open that window and get some fresh air into your lungs." My father lights his pipe. The familiar scent of burning rubber fills the car. I cough and open the window, getting a faceful of wind and rain, followed quickly by 2.5 pints of icy North Sea. "I think we should go and get the fish." "That ship out there," says my father, "is bringing wood from Norway. Coniferous wood. Used in the paper manufacturing industry since the late 15th century. The process was originally invented in China by Tsai Lun, around about AD 105. But the first paper mill in England was owned by John Tate in Hertford. The manufacture of continuous lengths, however, was... Oh, the Tates. Wasn't their youngest walking about with that Valerie Maskell? No. Yes, he was. The one that took ballet lessons for her fallen arches. No. This process was developed by the stationers Messer H and S Fordrinier. It was her, you remember. She was the one that got all the spots at Secretarial College. Quiet, Edith. The Fordriniers were assisted in this by Mr. Brian Donkin, an inventor and engineer. Donkin? Wasn't his step-uncle Stephanie a wholesale poulterer in Peatling Parlour? No. Yes, he was. It was their youngest that moved downstairs next door to the chemist in Wimbledon, nearly opposite the Gantlett. Shut up. Do you realise that if you look out there on a very clear day, you can't quite see Denmark? And if you look over there, you would almost catch a glimpse of France if it weren't invisible. Oh, the sea. I think we should get the haddock. Will you shut up about that bloody haddock? Why is it that every bloody year... Language! Every year our summer holiday consists of 2 weeks in Scarborough, Filey or Bridlington, sitting in a car in the rain, bickering. Why don't we go to bloody Denmark? Language! It's the toilets. What? What toilets? Your father can't bear foreign toilets. But he's never been abroad. Your Uncle Harry was in North Africa during the war, and their toilets... Ugh. But we're talking about Denmark. Their sanitary facilities make ours look primitive. I suppose you read that in Hygiene in Denmark by Rupert Bloody Graves. We did promise haddock. Oh, all right, we'll go and get your bloody flaming bloody haddock. The trouble with you two is you don't appreciate the beauties of nature. We drive off through a moderate to heavy spume. What's that you've got over there, my father barks. It's a book, I counter. What book? Comes his brusque reply. I. Biggles by Captain W.E. Graves, I riposte. Captain, eh? That sounds better, he re-riposts, and slams the engine into third. The plane banked sharply to the left as we hurtled downwards, but the Fokker-Wulf was still on our tail. Ah! Zing! Went the twin cowl-mounted Mittelschmerz 25mm cannons. Peng! It went in German, as one of the shells bit into the sleek wooden fuselage. Peng! Cogitated Biggles. That's German for bang. We've been hit, volunteered Ginger grimly. Nothing, said Biggles grimly, as he slipped his leather-gloved hand over the by now moistened joystick. He pulled it back in a series of sharp jerks. Level off her, Mo, put in Algy dryly through drawn lips. He stepped purposely into the body of the aircraft, past the by now shapely, nude lady navigator, and back into the rear of the plane. The door of the gents-only sauna hung precariously from one hinge. He slammed it shut with a haunting squawk and fought his way past the two naked waifs wrestling in perfumed sump oil. He erupted into the aft leather room to find Winko still chained to a cross, wearing the by now familiar black hood bearing the also familiar wing commanderic braid. "Have your way with me, you hunk of manhood," he hinted coyly. "What ho, old sport?" hazarded Algy gingerly. "I say, old man, the group's a bit dashed worried. Thinks you might have some kind of, well, you know, problem, you old bison." He fingered his cigarette nervously. "Don't worry about me, old tapir. I've pulled through a lot worse than this." The plane lurched suddenly as Biggles swerved to avoid a hail of bullets that pumped in spurts out of the penis-like nose cone of the pursuing Fokker. Algy rushed forward. "Everything okay, Skipper?" he admitted. "We haven't made it yet," inserted Biggles as he gritted his thighs and plunged his machine into a savage spin. As they plunged downwards, the mighty engines throbbed, and the well-lubricated pistons thrust themselves back and forth in their vice-like sheaths. "You look a bit green around the gills, old Eland," observed Biggles smoothly. "Never felt better," puked Algy. "Sorry about the mess," he opined. "Why can't you just say things?" snorted Biggles. "Tell you what, old man. Having a bit of trouble with this one. Could you just pop your hand down my Mae West? If it's an order, old Guillemot." "It is," grinned Biggles. "Right-ho, here it comes." Algy plunged a questing, sensitive hand into the group captain's flying jacket. The plane soared upwards. "Don't stop now, I'm nearly there. So am I." "Ooh, ah, ah," ejaculated Biggles and Algy together. They were through. The white silence of a cloud surrounded them. "What about me?" rasped Ginger. "Fuck off a sec." "Ooh," oohed Biggles and Algy. Then suddenly they were through it. Peace, calm, ecstasy. They floated as one in a post what can't be described in a children's book sort of feeling.
Ginger had missed out again, but he was used to this, and easing himself back into his cold leather chair, mused, "To heck with a lot of them. I'll just jolly well sit down here and improve the bally old mind a little, don't you know." Languidly, he cold-chiselled his way through the padlock on his air survival reading kit and snapped the seal of the 2.5mm file containing the Tincture of Cricket Pavilion. He clicked it neatly into the glue-sniffing socket on his oxygen mask and ran his rapidly glazing eyes over the emergency in-flight reading list. The complete works of Captain W.E. Johns. How to Speak English in Other Languages. The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud. "That's dashed odd," he thought. "Hun yid lit. Must have a gander." Cautiously, he opened the volume and gasped as he read inside the cover. "Happy bar mitzvah Algernon, old Ocelot. Keep off the pork. Love, Aunt Rachel already." What? So that's why Algy always wore his swimming togs in the showers, the flipping bounder. As the subtle aroma of grass clippings, blancoed canvas, and linseed oil swathed his olfactory organs, he flicked through the pages with curiosity. The theories of dreaming and its function. Flick, flick, he went. Symbols in dreams. No. Sexual symbols in dreams. No. Sexual symbols in dreams? Maybe. Then thwack. It was as if he had been struck nose before wicket by a cricket box hurled at full stench. Navigational dreams. Spot on! Chocks away, he enthused, and read hungrily on. In the following pages I shall prove that the entire psychology of man can only be understood with reference to the science of navigation. Quite right, interposed Ginger. I remember a 35-year-old patient whose prepubertal son was having recurrent nightmares in which he would push a raspberry up his left nostril and run into the middle of the lounge shouting "Pelmets." This caused such embarrassment that his father punished him by making him stand on a window ledge holding a whole punnet of raspberries. They became so heavy that he lost his balance and fell down the face of a huge white cliff in the shape of a gendarme's nose, after which he woke up to find himself inexplicably in the sea at the bottom of the cliff. In later discussions with the boy, it became apparent to him that the raspberries represented raspberries and the cliff was in fact a cliff. But to the psychoanalyst, the cliff is a glaring symbol of a navigational fetish. Man's life is divided into two phases. 1. Childhood, and 2. Navigation. Childhood is divided into the following stages. 1.1. Heavy petting. 1.2. Coital navigation. 1.3. Embryonic navigation. 1.4. Fetal navigation. 1.5. Neonatal navigation. 1.6. Infantile navigation. 1.7. The prepubertal navigational spurt. 1.8. Pubertal navigational day, and 1.9. Post-pubertal navigation, the beginning of the marine period, the onset of Regenwettertraum. A footnote. There would appear to be no equivalent in our language for this Viennese peasant word. The nearest would, I suppose, be soggy dreams. At this point, we come to the longer phase, navigation 2, which we may divide with Aesculapius, Galen, Pantajarli, Nietzsche, Marx, Len Dayton, and Hitler's dog into 2.1 at sea, 2.2 on land, 2.3 in the air, 2.4 other places. 2.1 navigation at sea may be divided into the following broad categories. 2.1 alpha on top of the sea, 2.1 beta under it, 2.1 gamma quite close to the sea, but not actually getting your feet wet. Schulwasserfußbekleidung nicht gestellt. Footnote. This Viennese student pork butcher's slang word literally means, my God, there goes a clever psychoanalyst. It is also an allusion to 12 Bream in My Wellingtons by Horatio Nelson, Admiral, a puzzling title which Freud was later brilliantly to interpret as an obvious apostolic complex, in which Nelson himself plays the Christ figure, Bream representing the early Christian fish symbol, and at the same time an overt corruption of the word dream, quite common in navigational dreams. He was also clearly in love with an as yet unborn military rubber fetishist. Freud intended later to expand this footnote into 12 volumes, provisionally entitled Generals, Admirals, Oedipus, Vagina Envy, Fish, Christ, Masturbation, and all sorts of other things like cucumbers, radishes, figs, donkeys, other people's bottoms, gallbladder fixations, teeth, snow, hash, uppers, downers, Bakelite underwear, sports commentators, pole vaulting, and the great Vaseline boom. But sadly, this was not to be. He died, leaving Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber to translate it into the Broadway smash hit Kiss My Twat, an all-goat musical comedy.
End of Side 1.
Beneath Biggles, that's damned clever, he hypnotised, and read on. In relation to this, I remember a 29-year-old female patient whose exactly adolescent son was having recurrent dreams about flying. In one dream, which he was able to recall particularly vividly because he was on a youth hosteling holiday in the Lake District, and his red-haired companion in the bunk above him had fallen asleep, dropping a navigational handbook, which spiraled down and struck him on the temple, causing the rapid onset of wakefulness. A fictional aviator called Bigglesworth and his companions are attempting to escape from a Fokker wolf which is pursuing them and shooting at them. They are hit somewhere in the back of the plane, and Algy, one of Biggles' companions, goes to inspect the damage. It is not serious. After a routine exchange with a wing commander in the rear compartment of the plane, he returns to the pilot's cabin to report that all is well. There, his group captain is having trouble with his flying jacket, but with Algy's help manages to sort it out and escape the pursuing Fokker at the same time. A typical dream recall of a particularly exciting episode in an adventure story for boys, or so it would seem. Let us look at the dream more closely. The first thing we notice is that the description is full of overt references to changes in direction. The plane banked sharply to the left. The plane lurched suddenly. Biggles swerved to avoid the pursuing Fokker, an unmistakable symptom of navigational obsessions. Note also the use of zoological terminology in their navigational exchanges with one another. Old bison, old tapir, and even old guillemot, clearly indicating a yearning for a pre-rational animal state of existence in which navigation was not yet distinguishable from simply running around. The boy patient clearly identifies himself with the minor character Ginger, who is excluded from the adventure because he is navigationally inadequate. At this point, Ginger stopped reading. Ginger, he thought? That's me. Inadequate? What a bally awful tone, don't you know what, ho, old chap? He slid back the Bakelite window and grinned through steel lips as he watched the book hurtle in a plinth-defying spiral towards an angry North Sea. Clop! I had been struck on the head, causing rapid wakefulness. The Anglia was now parked outside Thraxted's fish shop, with my mother inside, engaged in the purchase of haddock, and my father saying, "You've been bloody reading again." "I haven't." "Well, what's this in my hand?" "Oh, it's the Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, probably his most original work, in which he discovered a way of exploring the unconscious and found that neurotic symptoms are like dreams in that they are a product of conflict and compromise between the conscious and unconscious states. He was able to... "Is it?" he said, as he thumbed through the pages. "What's this?" As a little girl, she remembered her older brother and his friends asking her to remove her undergarments and performing cartwheels, thus displaying her genitalia to their curious gaze. In later life she... "I've got the haddock. What were you saying? What's that book?" "Nothing." The glove compartment opened and closed. "Nothing, just a road map." Who's Freud, then?" "He's an expert on navigation. He's very interesting. His theories of navigation, you see, longitude, latitude, that sort of thing." "Ah, well, that's enough of that. Let's get back to Mrs. Riches with this haddock." "Right." Quite a lot happened over the next few years. A disastrous sexual experiment with Rita Blake, my first love affair with another boy, stuffing snails into a gatepost with a net hoy, the hen-stealing nuns, pig-shit Freeman, Miss Chamberlain's 3 consecutive head girls pregnant, my questions about ejaculation to a biology master, Anthony Blonde in a book called Health and Hygiene for Secondary School Girls, written by myself and my brother, Albert the groundsman, me holding hands with Mark Collins in a math class, the couple copulating in the French library, painting John Wilder black, Who Knows Eskimo Nell, Monsieur le Bogue va pu, Purple Smoke, Little Boy's Eardrums, This Is a Raid, and elderly spinsters wanking off birthday cakes. But such trivia needs no elaboration. One childhood is much like another. Amateur psychologists who think it clever to explain the character of the later man for a jumble of largely fictitious memories can ferret for their filth in other people's autobiographies. They have opened the wrong book. Chapter 3. Cambridge. Cambridge, a university town built in a featureless, flat landscape. So featureless and flat you wonder why anyone chose it as a location for anything. The magnificence of St. John's, the noteworthy splendour of Trinity, the sheer pauntliness of the Backs. And gazing at the magnificent, noteworthy, sheer splendour of the Pauntly King's College Chapel, it would be a world-weary traveller indeed who did not pause to think, why the fuck didn't they build the whole town 2 inches to the right? A fair, if somewhat rudely couched question, to which an answer may be found only by turning back the clocks of time. Let us imagine it is the year 1282. An urgent message arrives at the court of King Edward I. "Most noble sire, I have built a bridge over the river Cam." The royal reply, dispatched with all regal velocity, reads, "Whatever for?" Thus the enterprising but foolhardy pontifex was left with a bridge on his hands, since it was apparent to everyone that this newly constructed thoroughfare, leading as it did from nowhere in particular to nowhere else at all, was a fumble. Occasional passers-by would point and mock, saying, "Who's the bloody fool that built a bridge here?" "I don't know, must be wrong in the head," he would reply, puce with shame. For years he sat by the bridge, wearing a weak smile, until one autumn he was hit on the head by a golden delicious. "Eureka!" he barked, evenly, with a Job-like disregard for time and place. Then, in a daze, he made his second big mistake. Rather than building some decent restaurants, a couple of pubs and a laundromat to attract human beings to his bridge, he hit on the rather dull idea of erecting some very high walls behind which a semi-aristocratic elite could hide from the outside world and go to each other's rooms for sherry. This was an extract from the Reverend E. W. Shepherd Walwyn's The Bridge over the River Cam, 1884. It is the year 1958. A Ford Anglia is joddering south along the A604, containing Chief Inspector and Mrs. Chapman, and a rather spotty figure precociously dressed in the kind of suit that he thinks doctors might wear. We arrived at Emmanuel College. I left 2 quivering parents and attempted to saunter past a lot of very important-looking people in gowns and stared around the courtyard. I could see no sign of a master's lodge. Overawed by the pauntly magnificence of the groups of overtly amusing academics, I asked an old gardener where it was. He told me. I found the door, but I was a quarter of an hour early, so I walked around for a time, trying not to look conspicuous and wondering why everyone was staring at me. At last it was 4 o'clock. I knocked on the door and was greeted by the gardener, who asked me to come through to his study. I said yes quite a lot, and nodded, particularly when he was talking about the history of coal mining and the Industrial Revolution. But when asked whether I was going to pass my A-levels, I gave a definite no to physics. He was clearly impressed by this, and at last, sensing a possible argument, thrust forward his head, raised his eyebrows to the point of nearly covering his bald patch, and asked, "Why not?" Well, I'm not sure." "Not sure? That means you're in doubt." "Well, yes." "Do you mean yes?" Yes. So a pass is quite possible?" Yes, possible." "Probable even?" "Well, let me put it another way. Are you going to fail?" "No." "Good. Then we'll see you in October." I left and stood for a moment in the corridor, trying to work out whether he had said yes or no. I decided that it amounted to an almost definite yes. Walked back through the courtyard, feeling that it was mine already, and was rather annoyed that no one was staring at me. "How did it go?" said the Anglia. "Oh, fine. Mind you, I've got to pass physics." "Well, you do that," it said, "won't you?" "Yes," I replied confidently. The engine choked a few times and then purred into motion. "I think we licked them this time," said Flying Officer Edith, casting a victorious eye over the fast-disappearing seat of learning she had come to hate during her 1.25-hour ordeal. Chief Inspector Biggles opened the throttle. He relaxed back into his seat with a satisfied grin as the familiar drone of the 927cc engine sped us on our way to eternity and sandwich spread on toast. A week later I was beginning to have my doubts. Could the man really have said yes, just like that? Would the rest of the college back up a gardener's judgment on my admission to Cambridge University? I was glad that while waiting for written confirmation I had been accepted by 2 London teaching hospitals, more realistic goals for a Melton Mowbray Grammar School oik. At St. Swithin's Hospital, I had been submitted to 20 seconds of searching questions. Dean: do you play rugby? Me: yes. Warden: we've got a John Chapman here. Is he any relation of yours? Me: yes, he's my brother. Warden: right, see you in September. Dean: wait a moment, what position do you play? Me: second row. Dean: September it is then. St. Mary's Hospital, if anything, was much tougher. I was seated in a room with a 110-page intelligence test to be completed in 15 minutes. An official started the clock and left me to it. After 10 minutes I was still less than halfway through, and as always in moments of panic I thought, steady on, old man, you are English, and stopped. I lit my pipe and stared blankly at the clock for a whole minute. Picked it up out of curiosity and toyed with it and put it down again. Somehow or other it now seemed I had another 10 minutes to spare, which I thought I might as well spend completing their test. Hang on, aren't you cheating? I asked myself. Yes, intelligently, I replied. After lunch I returned for my interview. As I entered, the two interviewers flinched, because as far as they were concerned, they were looking at a person with an IQ of 495. They blinked a little nervously and fell back onto the only line of questioning which they thought could outmaneuver Einstein and Bertrand Russell rolled into one. Dean: do you play much sport? Me: I'm very fond of mountaineering, but I've only led a few very severe climbs, and I'm not very experienced on snow and ice work. I play second row for Melton Mowbray Rugby Football Club, first team, and my brother is captain of the first 15 at Barts, though despite being 6 foot 4 inches tall, I'm faster than him over 100 yards, having clocked 10.4 seconds at the age of 15 and a half. And I was second in the All England Amateur Athletics Association 440-yard competition last year, the winner of which was Malcolm Yardley, who equalled the European record of 40.1 seconds. I limped in a poor 3 seconds later, but it's not really my distance. I only entered out of curiosity. They apologised for not being able to think of any other questions, and said that unfortunately they would not be able to offer me a professorial chair for another 7 years, although it would be there for asking if I could bear to wait that long. So by the end of the day I knew I could have a place at either St. Swithin's or Mary's. I was still uncertain about Cambridge, but felt just sufficiently euphoric to join my brother later that evening at St. Swithin's, where he was holding his 21st birthday party. The next morning I woke up from a drunken coma to find myself inexplicably back in my bed in Melton Mowbray. I stumbled downstairs to breakfast. Perhaps yesterday's events had all been part of a drunken dream. But they couldn't have been. I definitely remembered my brother congratulating me on being accepted at St. Swithin's. That was why I'd drunk so much. I sat down to face breakfast with a spinning head and a mouth that could have been a British Rail ashtray. There was still no news from Cambridge. Suddenly there was a bellow from the direction of the front door of our house, which stood in the not particularly portly grounds of Melton Mowbray Police Station. My mother swept into the kitchen with a white envelope, gripped in the King George V Jubilee Commemoration zinc envelope tongs. The jaws of the great tongs parted, and the envelope thuffed onto the blue Formica breakfast table. "It's from Cambridge," she shrieked, feigning nonchalance. "Kiss me, Hardy," I said, and broke the seal of my fate. I read the letter 4 times, looked out of the window for a moment, and read it again. "What does it say?" said Edith. It says, I think it says..." I went outside, walked around the house twice, and came back in to read the letter again. It had gone. There was nothing there. Oh, well, I thought, may as well finish my breakfast. You're mad, Chapman. We haven't got any zinc envelope tongs. You're thinking of the Edward VIII abdication mug, which will be very valuable one day if we keep it long enough. The letter was genuine. I had been accepted by Emmanuel College, and I ran away and hid for the entire summer looking after a herd of goats in Caton Bay. I had passed all my A-levels and was very pleased to get 65% in physics and an amazing 185% in chemistry. Unfortunately, I'd been taking the exams of the Oxford University Board, which were regarded with snotty-nosed contempt by the University of Cambridge. Apparently, no one knew anything about chemistry at Oxford. They were all too busy lounging around in bottle-green velvet suits, holding lilies and quoting lines by Tim Bryden and Dennis Keat. This meant that I had to take a separate exam in organic chemistry. And so I stood, facing a bench covered with apparatus I'd never seen before, in a vast brown hall. I wasn't alone. There were some 40 other nervous candidates at similar benches, soiling their cavalry twills at the mind-boggling array of jars containing alien chemicals. 40 brains turned to dry ice as the invigilator stepped onto his podium and started the competition by saying, "Gentlemen, you may now begin." For 10 minutes I tried to look as if I was doing something, moving bits of apparatus, taking the occasional apparently casual glance at the examination paper. After 11 minutes of this useless activity, I realized that I didn't know how to do a single experiment. For the first time, I experienced the full force of an attack of ignorance. Ears full of cotton wool, eyes staring into a tyro-blenching void, legs that wouldn't move. Time seemed to stand still, although a strange feeling in the nape of my buttocks told me that it wasn't. Bang! Someone 2 benches away had apparently exploded and was being covered in an asbestos sheet by the invigilator and 2 attendants. Bang! Came from behind me as a young gentleman from Hong Kong ran for a fire extinguisher. Then, bang! As fragments of a Liebig condenser flew around the room like shrapnel. Now I knew why they had brown walls in there. Stop! Everybody stop! Right, if I find any more of you bloody idiots heating up ether over an open flame, I'll kill you! I haven't been a munitions expert in 2 world wars to get slaughtered by a load of ignorant tits. If you don't know what you're doing, get out! This didn't have a calming effect on anyone, but it did interrupt the trance-like state of the student opposite me, who began putting chemicals into a beaker. He measured out some pale blue liquid with confidence, added some white powder, poured in 5 cc's of a colourless solution, placed it over a Bunsen burner, and the contents of the beaker went a rather pleasing shade of orange. The man knew what he was doing, and I followed every move he made. I looked round to see what everyone else was doing, to double-check. After a series of manipulations, we both finished up with a greyish powdery residue. From the wording of the question, this should really have been white, but I was quite pleased at having any residue at all under the circumstances. However, my helpful friend wasn't satisfied with the impurity of his product. He must have the best. And reaching for the bang! The next time I took organic chemistry, I was completely confident. Everyone appeared to be watching me, and I was no longer frightened by the brown walls and the immense array of bottles and chemicals, and got a perfectly white crystalline substance. The same invigilator was present on his podium, and seemed much calmer, less imposing than the year before. He didn't even mind the odd bang. I expect his wife was no longer unfaithful, or he'd had his piles removed. I wasn't surprised that I passed. After all, I was at Cambridge. I'd bought a gown, several club ties, walked around in a tweed suit with a pipe and tried to look clever. The pipe was very useful because it meant that if anyone said anything I didn't understand, I could puff on it and seem incredibly deep in thought. The tweed suit didn't fool anybody, but the pipe worked a treat. In tutorials, I was asked fewer questions. It also helped clobber the stench of formalin in the dissecting rooms. This is one of the many hurdles in medicine. The first is dissecting a worm, a dogfish, and a rabbit at school, then your very first real dead human being. I got over them, and within 2 weeks I was conveniently using my cadaver's mouth as an ashtray. My tutor in physiology, Professor McKenna, was a Scotsman who now lives in Dunedin, New Zealand, so obviously you would use the word doer in describing him, but it wouldn't be true. He was a tall, fat, randy bastard with a goatee beard and a very agile mind above it. Again, at tutorials, we all giggled at Hibben, and the other 4 of us were rather glad that he took up so much of the professor's time by questioning him. So he very rarely got round to discussing our essays. Footnote: essay, a collection of other people's thoughts disguised to look like one's own, in the judging of which originality is heavily penalized. After about 5 sessions, Professor McKenna became irritated with our tittering and rounded on us and said, "I like Hibben. Unlike the rest of you, he knows how to ask the question why. A habit that gets knocked out of us by parents at a very early age when it should be a gift to be nurtured." We crept out with our notebooks full of humility. It was one of the few really important things I learned at Cambridge. But I still think I'd know more about the physiology of the human body than the urinary system if Hibben hadn't asked why quite so often. Professor McKenna's little lecture had inspired him to ask why at every possible occasion, and he often astounded ordinary passers-by by asking them why. I wasn't aware that rabbits were capable of making any noise until I slit one's throat while it was nailed down in the physiology lab. I realised that the animal was technically dead, in that its brain had been mushed up by a probe and so could feel no pain. But I and my partner James Wellwood were a bit surprised when it raised its head from the block and squeaked. After a few puffs on our pipes, we plucked up courage and slit its chest open to find a rather disturbingly pulsating heart, which we courageously linked up to various pieces of apparatus. Could this be vivisection? Yes, we thought. But soon it all became fun. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-vivisection, but I am anti-unnecessary vivisection. I've seen none of that in this country, the United Kingdom that is, but I did see rather a lot of rats slaughtered at a medical school in New York, where a newly qualified intern was fiddling around with rats' brains without any apparent explanation for his action. He said he thought it was something to do with the pineal gland. So, what's a rat? They do the same thing with human beings there with volunteer prisoners, who, if they agree to have something alien inserted into their bodies, not just bits of plastic and metal, but untried drugs, get reduced sentences. In this country, on the whole, we use medical students as guinea pigs. I have never entered one of these contests, and I'm glad, because a friend of mine took part in a double-blind trial on a drug that brings down your blood pressure, only to find out a year later that it could cause permanent impotence. He was lucky to have been given the placebo. In my first year at Cambridge, I tried to join the Footlights Club, realising that the only reason I'd gone there in the first place was that I'd seen Jonathan Miller performing in a television version of a Footlights annual review. As a fresher at the Society's fair, I went from stall to stall in my houndstooth check pork pie hat and pipe. I didn't join KUKA, QSOC, or Evangelical Aeromodelling, but I did join the Medical Society, the Mountaineering Club, and other important political organisations. Eventually, I arrived at my destination, the Footlights stall, behind which was David Frost, a lone figure boiling underpants. He told me that nobody could join, since it was by invitation only. I questioned the point of the stall. "None at all, really," said David Paradine Frost. "We only have 25 undergraduate members per year, so push off." So, I hadn't been invited to join the Footlights, the only purpose of my university career. Neither had Tony Branch, who'd come to Cambridge to read law with the intention of switching to the light entertainment course after one term. We organised a smoking concert, or smoker, a kind of cabaret revue where people in dinner jackets and black ties sit around laughing at themselves. Satire. I'd invited the secretary of the Footlights, David Frost, the president of the Footlights, Peter Bellwood, Tim Brinton, a radio personality, Nio Marsh, the gardener, D.H. and Frida Lawrence, Lord David Cecil, Lord and Lady Clitt, the Earl of Penis, and Sir Roger Lupin. We gave them gallons of claret and didn't start until they'd drunk at least a bottle each. The show, just as we thought, was successful, and we were both invited to go to a Footlights audition before the committee, in the hope that they would allow us to appear in one of their smokers, which was a sort of second audition, where you had to be awfully funny. I impersonated a carrot, and a man with iron fingertips being pulled off stage by an enormous magnet. In the same set of auditions, John Cleese did a routine of trampling on hamsters, and can still do a good pain-ridden squeak. We were both selected, and very soon we were able to wear black taffeta sashes with Ars est celere artem on them. The art is to conceal the art. And as members of the committee, we were able to prevent all sorts of talented people from joining the club. The Footlights Club at that stage had had members the week before like Jimmy Edwards, Julian Sallard, J. Miller, B. Gascoigne, the Goodalls, Noel Coward, Irving Thrush, Cole Porter, honorary, Mr. and Mrs. Not Arthur Askey, Leslie Brickus, and Tarquin Thing, who wrote all the Beatles hits and posthumously curtsied at Muhammad Ali when he thought he wasn't looking. Oh, and also Peter Cook. Although by then Peter had gone down from Cambridge, even in those days he had an obsessive disregard for David Frost and came back to punish him by being funnier and more intelligent at the smoking concerts. I remember one particular sketch where Peter was talking as the keeper of the Holy Bee of Ephesus, where he explained to the pilgrims that the Holy Bee was kept in a matchbox, but that it could cure all ills if they placed 3 shekels through the lid. After they'd given the 3-shekel piece, and weren't cured of even one ill, he explained to them that they'd probably stunned the bee. Peter got rather angry with God during this routine, frequently cursing and pointing up to heaven because he had so many complaints from customers, and at one moment he went white and left the stage clutching his chest. Either he had forgotten his lines, there was a God, or he'd overeaten. But the most important thing about the Footlights Club was that it thought itself a more elite group than even the Footlights Club. The Middlesex County Cricket Club had nothing on them. They wouldn't even allow His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales in to hoover the carpet. This taught all the members the kind of supreme arrogance that made Genghis Khan what he was yesterday. The Footlights' final examination took place over 2 weeks in June at the Arts Theatre, Cambridge, and if you earned a distinction, you would be offered postgraduate work at the Oxford Playhouse and the Travers, Edinburgh, pick up a PhD at the Lyric Theatre, Shaftesbury Avenue, followed by a lecture tour of New Zealand and culminating in a full doctorate on Broadway. Our exams were open to public scrutiny. They were rigorous and cruelly fair. If you got laughs, you passed. If not, you failed. Compared to these, the university exams were about as reliable a guide to a student's ability as the width of his mother's kneecaps, and I treated them with the nonchalance they deserved. Around me, others were going mad with the terror of failure. The strain was too much for one gentleman on my staircase, whom the head porter found throwing his own shit about the room. He made a hell of a mess of the place and was carried off screaming. I think he got an aigretat, which means that he got his degree but didn't have to take the exams because of illness. 2 other aigretats were less genuine. One law student, who had done no work at all except on bottles of claret, hired a car and had himself driven out into the middle of the fens, where he was found a week later wandering around in the fields, claiming that he had amnesia. In case he's forgotten, his name is... well, I'm sure he hasn't. Another friend, who was reading Oriental Studies, had spent his 3 years at Cambridge flying aeroplanes. He faked appendicitis, and because his 2 main papers were several days apart, was brave, stupid, or afraid enough to be slit up and have a perfectly healthy organ removed. I left Cambridge with a BA in Natural Sciences, lower second class, several bottles of college sherry, and a PhD in claret. Chapter 4. St. Swithin's. In September 1962, the reconditioned engine of the Ford Anglia purred out of action in front of College Hall, St. Swithin's Hospital Medical School. I ordered Chapman, my father, to carry my trunk up to my room, and went to a nearby inn while he and his wife unpacked my belongings and tidied up the room for my arrival. I left the pub at 3:30, walked back through the courtyard past a lot of rather spotty ex-grammar school boys, absolute oiks, the lot of them, strolled up to my room and dismissed my parents. I cast my eyes round the room. The bed looked too narrow. I tested it for creakiness and made a mental note to tell the porter to bring me a larger and less creaky place to sleep. On the desk, a Bakelite version of Bird's Eye Maple, I noticed something wrapped in greaseproof paper, which is a piece of paper soaked in lard. I unwrapped the package. It was a cake from my mother. How sweet, I thought, as I threw it into the wastepaper basket. I opened up a small suitcase containing my books. Climbing in Snowdonia, Nanga Parbat, The Ascent of K2, Cambridge University in the Andes, The Art of Course Rugby, and I'll Teach You Drinking. I flicked through a few pages of this volume and came to St. Swithin's Hospital. It had 3 stars by it. To supplement my meagre student grant, I decided to do some cabaret. Full of confidence, being ex-Footlights, Tony Hendra and myself went along to the Blue Angel nightclub for an audition. We chose the Blue Angel because it was one of the best nightclub spots for revue, and we'd read in the stage, in an advertisement that sounded like whistling in the dark, how David Frost had recently been retained there for a 2nd glorious month. However, we were accepted at the audition, and in 2 weeks' time we found ourselves top of the bill, which meant we didn't start our act until any time from 2 to 2:30 a.m., meaning that I didn't get back to college until 3:30, having to get up again at 8:30 in time for a ward round at 9. I found this routine too gruelling after 5 more weeks, and we left the Blue Angel, to be followed by a promising newcomer called Dave Allen. I wasn't just at St. Swithin's Hospital to perform late-night cabarets and West End revues. I also helped to start annual concerts for the Hippocrates Society and organise the Christmas ward shows. The last was a splendid excuse for avoiding a family Christmas. I could join in with the rest of the lads wandering around the wards, entertaining the moribund with liberal supplies of barrels of beer made portable by the use of hospital trolleys. Some of the nursing staff, the huge matron in particular, raised objections to these festive revels in that they were disruptive of hospital routine and, in certain cases where beds were trampled on by spectators, deleterious to the well-being of the patients. But if I were ill enough to need to be in hospital over Christmas, I can think of no better atmosphere in which to peg out. Nurses wearing silly hats, urine bottles decorated with holly, mistletoe on the drip stands, general bacchanalia. Apart from the entertainment, there was yet another side to medicine. I was used to dead bodies, but now I had to deal with live human beings. This was another hurdle to overcome. And I remember on my first day as a dresser, we were taught by the houseman how to take blood from patients. He suggested that we should all take blood from each other, and lined us up in pairs, so that you would take 5 ml from your partner, who would then take 5 ml of blood from you. Fortunately, he left, and we were left on our own. I refused to have my blood taken by the idiot who was my partner, and I'm sure he felt the same about me. I arrived alone at the ward the next morning at 8:30 to find that I had to take what amounted to about a pint of blood from 9 different patients. And, as everyone knows, in a hospital, if you complain, you get worse treatment, less attention, and an ice-cold enema. The next couple of weeks I spent pretending to look like a doctor while looking at people's feces and staring into their sputum jars. There was one particular patient whom the nurses had finally refused to bath. His abdominal surgery had been mismanaged at another hospital, and he'd been brought into the teaching hospital to be sorted out. His abdomen had been covered with aluminium paste in an attempt to prevent the excoriation of the skin caused by his 5 substitute arseholes. It was as though his bowels had been doctored by a telephone engineer. Any competent plumber would have done a better job. No one really knew which hole led anywhere. Marcus Pine and myself, as dressers, were ordered by the sister to bath him. We put him into a bath, which we filled with disinfectant, and were both vaguely nauseated by the unformed turds which slipped out of his orifices. He was pleased by the comfort of the bath and the fact that we hadn't thrown up in his presence. We dried him and carried him back to bed, and he died the next morning. John Cleese, who had just finished his finals in Cambridge, getting a rather snooty upper second, wanted somewhere to stay in London while he wrote for BBC Radio, such things as You'll Be Surprised, a Christmas show for Dick Emery. I was very friendly with the junior warden, Buzz Mangrove, and had managed to find a passkey to all of the rooms in the Hall of Residence on the black market, and I knew that there were several empty ones. I gave John the key and suggested that he should stay in the room normally occupied by a person called Nick Spratt. Now, Nick Spratt was a direct but distant descendant of Sir Percival Spratt, the first surgeon to be really a surgeon rather than a barber. Buzz Mangrove mentioned to me that perhaps Mr. Cleese should begin to think of finding alternative accommodation. Buzz at this time was 5'1", and I've no reason to believe that he's grown any bigger now. And apart from being junior warden at the hospital, he was senior registrar to the man called the Beast. The Beast was senior surgeon and stood 6'5" with no shoes and excluding bright red hair, which meant that Buzz, during operations, had to stand on a box. The Beast would do anything. He was the last of the heroic surgeons. He would inspire such confidence in his ability that patients would practically plead to have their entire livers taken out by him. I remember one day most particularly when the Beast was operating, and he told Buzz that he had a malignant melanoma, an extremely nasty kind of cancer, on his own big toe. Immediately he climbed up onto the table and asked Buzz to amputate it. Buzz didn't want to do this, but the Beast insisted he was right. The toe was removed, and the report came back from pathology reading blood blister. My sexual life at St. Swithin's consisted of going to bed with women while dreaming about men. This is hardly even partly true in retrospect. It's just that I definitely do remember, once or twice, thoughts of men's bodies creeping into my mind while in coitus. Only that sort of thing just doesn't make for neat sentences. The first one was the student's traditional friend, a nurse, a sack of flour that you met at the hop and persuaded back to your room for coffee, having put all the chairs in a friend's room so that the only seating accommodation is the bed. She was rather podgy and extremely repellent, but I just wanted to get my end away. She must have been some kind of descendant of Richard Gordon's rigor mortis. Perhaps her mother was a nurse at St. Swithin's in about 1939. She was a real lie-down-and-think-of-hockey and England type, and after a brief grope that was not enthusiastically received, I thought, the bar's still open, I'll get rid of her. She said, it's too late now, matron says we must be in by 10:30. Was this some kind of devious come-on? I looked her hard in the breasts and thought, yuck. I politely pushed her out of the room, across the square to the hospital, and over the traditional nurses' hostel entrance, the mortuary gate. Then I ran back to the bar. There was another female student. We had noticed each other across tables filled with sard-lodden meals. She was getting a lot of attention from the lads, but of a rather fawning, not daring to ask nature. It was, "Can I carry your books home?" time. She was drooled over constantly. With very good legs, small but well-formed tits, she was at least as intelligent as Alexis de Tocqueville, Alexander Graham Bell, and Alec Plitt put in a box. And so, on an idyllic summer afternoon, it was tea-time in the students' refectory, I sat down at her table. Ignoring her minions, I boldly passed her a plate of spread sandwiches and asked her if she'd go. She was intelligent enough to say, "See you in my room tonight," with none of this pointless preamble of going out to dinner, sitting in cinemas holding sweaty hands, love letters, and all that timid avoidance of the real issue. We had a bloody good time for a whole year. She was athletic and imaginative. We went right through the card. It wasn't just British missionary, but doggy on the floor standing, on the desk, in the shower, in the bath, near the bath, at someone else's place while they weren't looking, and in a guard's van through the whole of Birmingham. I liked the experience, but after about 9 months or so, it began to pall, and I felt I would rather spend more time in the bar drinking with the lads, hoping to be too late back in my room for the "Hello, I'm lonesome" telephone call. For a bit of variation one night, I tried the wife of a student who'd been foolish enough to get married. She had about 3 children then, but she was still raring to go. She had large knockers and a very thorough knowledge of what dong's like. Her husband was a friend of Buzz Mangrove and was pissed out of his mind in the bar, but Buzz had noticed her absence and suspected me. He didn't interrupt, but listened outside my door as I came between her breasts for the second time. The description of this passage has made me feel... excuse me. That's better. After all this frenzied activity, I decided that I should do some clinical tests on myself. So whenever I went in a taxicab, tube, train, or bus, I looked at each passer-by and tried to tell myself honestly which ones I would like to go to bed with. And the ratio of boys to girls was something like 7-3, which puts me clearly on the homosexual side of the scale as suggested in the Kinsey report. I was largely homosexual and worried about it. A trip to New Zealand and America made me a little more broad-minded about myself, and immediately after qualifying I gave up medicine and became a raging poof. But no mincing, a butch one with a pipe. There are lots more memories of St. Swithin's hospitals, and I'll tell you one of them. As a medical student at that time, you were required to drag out at least 20 babies on your own and sew up the results of your errors. I went to St. Clive's Hospital in the south of London for 4 weeks, and my fellow student there was called David Sadza. We shared a room. He, through no fault of God's, happened to be black, and I white. The staff nurse in midwifery, I blame her for this, happened to be South African and very white. So David did about 4 deliveries to my 40. He was quite simply never asked, because blacks could not be trusted. He was not even allowed to do the sewing up after an episiotomy. An episiotomy, incidentally, means cutting through the labia and perineal musculature to ease the passage of the probably unwanted infant into a life it didn't ask for. I became quite good at sewing up vaginas. I suppose it was because I was thinking of their past and future contents. But I was rather annoyed. A new regulation had just come into force allowing midwives to do episiotomies, so that they were keen to do one whenever they could. They were not allowed to do the stitching, so students like G. Chapman were disturbed every half hour to repair their messy work, which meant that I kept missing David Frost's not so much a programme, more a way of life. There was a patient I once examined just before the programme. I thought she was in labour and likely to give birth soon. The South African midwife, who had already accused me of losing the keys to the drug cupboard, said, "No, she isn't. She's only 14 and hasn't got any pains." I informed her that pains, and her age for that matter, were quite irrelevant, and that all the signs, including the contractions, showed that she was definitely in the first stage of labour. The midwife said nonsense, and I went back to watch the programme. Just as Bernard Levin was about to say something very interesting to Harvey Orkin, I got bleeped. I ran up to the labour ward, and while I was scrubbing up, the girl gave birth. The midwives panicked. I gave the girl her child after the formality of tying off the umbilical cord and weighed the placenta. She asked me my name, and in gratitude called the placenta Graham, though the child had to be called Alvar after its father. It was the easiest birth I'd ever seen, perhaps because she was so young and had none of the fear and worry that is commonly induced by older members of the female sex in order to dramatize their role in life. I've always thought of birth as one of the most natural processes and not one needing the interference of medical science. Most women in the world have their babies behind a bush in a squatting position, in which even a breech delivery can be performed by one person without unnatural interference. For male readers, imagine being 9 months constipated, having inadvertently swallowed a coconut whole, and then being asked to lie on an operating table, legs apart, with lots of people watching dressed in silly clothes. Would you be able to shit? In my view, maternity wards should consist of carefully arranged shrubberies, with earplugs for each mother, so they don't have to hear, "Oh, I had a terrible time with my first." "Wrong way round, is it, dear?" "Oh, poor thing, 25 stitches I had the last time." "Oh, they've got you on a drip, have they?" Childbirth would be completely painless if grandmothers had their lips sewn up. And if anyone ever says to you, "I didn't go through all that agony to bring you into the world for this," either 1, run away, 2, punch them in the teeth, or 3, say, "Don't give me that, you fucking cow. If you want to go and work in a pit hacking out fucking coal all day, you bloody well can." I got fed up with having to sew up so many unnecessary incisions, and annoyed at the South African staff nurse's attitude towards my friend. One night, after I'd just finished sewing up a patient, he was called to a delivery. The South African nurse refused to allow him into the theatre, and I was called. I arrived to find a perfectly natural birth in progress, and was told by the South African nurse that Mr. Sadser had refused to do an episiotomy. I said that I agreed with him. There didn't seem to be any need for one, but the harridan kept advancing with a pair of scissors. I said, "No, this one's all right." The baby's head had already stretched the vagina, and it seemed obvious that it would come out without any help or damage to the mother. She insisted it wouldn't, and again approached the labia with her scissors. I hit her on the jaw with my elbow, and she fell to the floor. I was keeping my hands sterile for the delivery of an intact baby. The baby was born from an unscathed vagina. This was as much a relief to me as to the mother. The medico-legal complications of a split perineum combined with an assaulted midwife would not have been pauntly in the least. Chapter 5. New Zealand. March 1964. The new biochemistry and physiology block of St. Swithin's Hospital was being opened by Her Majesty the Queen Mother. At the time, being Secretary of the Students' Union, I was invited to join Her Majesty for tea with other representatives of the student body after her tour of the new premises. The Queen Mother had an excellent complexion and was extremely charming. I was very pleased to find out that she had asked to come to tea with the students, and not with a lot of old gits in red gowns and stupid floppy hats. During tea, I explained to Her Majesty that I had the offer of going to New Zealand as a member of the cast of Cambridge Circus, a revue, but that this would mean taking 6 months off medicine, and my parents had yelped strongly against this. The royal person said, "It's a beautiful place, you must go." I used this remark on my parents as if it was a royal command, and it worked. My mother was now able to go into the butcher's shop and say, "Oh, the Queen Mother said he must go." 10 minutes later, I was on a plane to Christchurch. John Cleese had a shower in Karachi, lost his watch and held up the plane for an hour while he looked for it. I didn't particularly mind the delay because I was sitting next to a rather nice-looking Commonwealth sailor. We arrived at Sydney at 7:10, and I took the next plane for Christchurch at 12:20. Christchurch was a shithole of a place, made all the worse because we'd left England in spring and arrived there in autumn. It was pissing down rain and cold. We were taken to a temperance hotel made of wood. After an appalling meal, we were shown to our rooms. Mine was so cold and damp, and there was mildew on the bed covers. The whole group moved to a hotel built of brick that served drinks to the residents. You have to bear in mind that the licensing laws in New Zealand at that time meant that bars could only open between 5:30 p.m. and 6 p.m. This meant, of course, that at 6:10 p.m. the streets were full of white New Zealanders beating up Maoris, or the other way round, depending on who had managed to get the most drunk quickest. We felt very privileged at the access to drink and warm beds, and slept quite happily until noon the next day. John Cleese and myself decided to have lunch at the hotel because we were performing in the theatre that afternoon and evening, and it didn't seem likely that we would get a meal. I asked for a 3-egg omelette. The waitress was astonished and said, "What?" I said, "A 3-egg omelette," and pointed to the words on the menu saying 3-egg omelette. She said, "A 3-egg omelette?" And I said, "Yes," pointing again. 5 minutes later she returned with a large omelette with 3 fried eggs on top. Even people 3 tables away threw up.
End of Side 2.
We flew to Dunedin, a town in the south of the island, named after a mixture of Edinburgh and Dundee, and with a perceptible Scottish influence. After a couple of days there, we flew to Timaru, a town about the size of my house, the only difference being that there is no seafront in Highgate, and Timaru doesn't have a theatre as big as mine. I wanted to see the mountains, the New Zealand Alps, and managed to persuade John Cleese and Tim Brooke-Taylor to join me in paying for a flight around them. It was a spiffing flight with heavenly views that really gripped you by the balls. Well, actually, the bit between your balls and your asshole. They were great, with a capital G, one R, one E, one A, and a T in lower case. The single-prop four-seater Cessna's engine purred as Captain W.E. Hillary flew us across mountain ridges, emerald-green chasms in the ice, and countless glaciers. We landed on one of the glaciers that had been counted. "Crikey," whistled Ginger Brooke-Taylor. "Damn good thing old Groupie put the skis on the old underbelly." "Yes, confided John Algy Cleese into his air-sickness bag as we came into land on the Fox Glacier. Tim and I stepped out of the plane, exhilarated and confident, and sank into 4 feet of snow. Apart from that, nothing happened. Group Captain W.G. Grace taxied the plane round for takeoff, the engine revved, and the Cessna shot off for all the world like a gannet into the blue with bits of white. We yelled and stamped so much with indignation that we sank another foot into the snow, and, as luck would have it, thereby attracting the attention of Sir Edmund Hillary and Uffa Fox, who had been playing poker for several months in their marooned Ford Anglia while waiting for the snow to thaw. At first they were alarmed at our intrusion. They wanted to be alone together. The atmosphere was tense. Excuse me. Excuse me. Can you tell me the way to Timaru?" I volunteered. After my tour of New Zealand and 3 months in New York with Cambridge Circus, I came back to St. Swithin's to pass pathology and therapeutics extremely well, narrowly missing one of the 2 prizes in therapeutics. Well, at least I was in the last 6. Then came my final exams: medicine, surgery, midwifery, and gynecology. Medicine I felt I didn't deserve to pass, but did, realizing how little you know is the first step towards, etc., etc. Surgery I should have passed, but didn't. I knew that I'd passed on my paper, and my short cases were simple enough. A row of about 10 patients you have to diagnose quickly and suggest possible treatments for. And for my long case, I had an extremely cooperative patient, who told me much more than she should have about her thyrotoxicosis and its surgical treatment. Unfortunately for me, a rather silly man, a pompous surgeon wearing a scarlet gown and a silly floppy hat for the sole purpose of intimidating examinees, asked me where I'd been trained. He took exception to the fact that it was St. Swithin's, and in particular had great personal animosity towards the beast. I failed. Midwifery I felt I should have passed, but did rather mess up my long case, never having encountered a pregnant dwarf with unusual hip deformities as a result of a road accident during any of my tuition, even in any textbook small print. This meant that I had 6 months to spend before I could take the examinations again. I didn't need to do a great deal of work on surgery, just keep my revision topped up. I read for about an hour a day and went to the occasional ward round. My tutor in gynecology and midwifery was so enraged at my failure that he gave me a 3rd-degree grilling in his weekly tutorials that I attended. This left the rest of my time free to write with John Cleese and to go to script conferences for the Frost Report, a programme featuring D. Paradine Frost, J. Cleese, R. Barker and R. Corbett. My introduction to fellow writers Michael Palin, Terry Jones, Eric Idle, Barry Cryer, Dick Vosper, David Nobbs, etc., was a very happy one, and at the end of a very successful run of 13 half-hour programmes, I had no problem with midwifery and gynecology and passed quite easily. Surgery, too, seemed to be easier this time, with the exception of an extremely uncooperative patient for my long case. A fat lump of a man of 45 years of age, whose only complaint was painful ankles and a mild chronic bronchitis. This could have been arthritis because of his obese condition, but that just wasn't enough to discuss for my main case. I started again and asked him about his weight, whether he had lost or gained any weight recently. No, he insisted he hadn't. His weight had remained the same for years. After a complete re-examination, I had nothing to add to my findings, and the prospect of failure loomed as I approached the professor of surgery. I told him what I had found, and he agreed and said, "And?" Well, that's all, sir." "Did you ask him about his weight?" "Yes, sir. He said it's been the same for years." "Did he? Are you sure you asked him about his weight?" For some reason, my confidence returned. I didn't want to go through all this again. "Yes, I asked him several times. He said it had stayed the same." "I don't think so," added another examiner at the professor's side. "Well, go and ask him," I almost shouted. This they did, and came back, and the professor said somewhat apologetically, What would you have thought if he'd told you he'd lost 2 stones in weight in the last month? Cancer, sir. Whereof? Lung, sir. Look at those x-rays. I did. There was the growth. This man had been selected as a difficult lung case purely because the only indicative symptoms were recent weight loss accompanied by swollen ankles, a variant of peripheral pulmonary arthropathy commonly seen in the fingers but then only recently described as a diagnostic sign in the ankle. After this, I happily went through the suggested courses of treatment and the prognosis for the patient. They were pleased, I passed, I was pleased. Chapter 6. Ibiza. After my final examinations, the prospect of 3 months writing a film on a Mediterranean island appealed to me more than 6 months of looking into ears, noses and throats. The new, long fuselage Boeing Ford Anglia log 7 to the power of the cube root of 987 GTQ stopped. Its engines didn't choke, splutter or cough. The wheels did not screech on the tarmac, and the nearest aeroplane that actually shuddered to a halt was a Douglas Dakota prototype at Reykjavik on January the 8th, 1937. Neither did the grim-faced pilot throw off his goggles, sigh with relief, turn to his co-pilot and say, "We made it, Ginger." I'd never been to Spain before, and was about to start now. Even the foreignness of the place seemed alien, except for my pipe, several packets of 3 Nuns and St. Bruno mixed, and the odd gin and slimline tonic with ice but no lemon in it. We arrived at the villa, which was the upper apartment of a 2-floor building, very spacious, with 2 balconies and absolutely covered in fucking bougainvillea, so picturesque it made you want to excrete. The next day I hired a bicycle, and so did John Cleese. He couldn't ride his, but then he was only 25 years old. As John pointed out, transport in Ibiza at that time was rather primitive, and we needed individual conveyances so that we could examine the beaches in the shortest possible time to find out which would be the best one for writing a film set in London. This would take, say, 2 weeks of the working period, which was 3 months anyway, and there's plenty of time yet, said John. I think we should have bikes, because we're bound to want to go off and buy pens and pieces of paper, and pens and things, and scotch tape, and a pair of scissors, and typewriter ribbon, and, well, look, it's taken me 2 weeks to get acclimatised, and I still haven't thrown off this throat. John Cleese, whom I'd always known as an over-industrious, painstakingly meticulous worker, appeared to be hinting at something. It is rather hot, isn't it? I'm feeling a bit groggy myself, I said. Perhaps a couple of weeks' rest might be a good idea. Do you think that we should? I mean, David and all that, said John. I mean, he has paid us, Graham. Yes, I suppose you're right. Yes, I'll probably be all right tomorrow. Right, yes, fine then. Fine, great. Oh, shit. Do you mind if we don't start work until tomorrow evening? Only I promised I'd take Connie to Calabasas tomorrow, and she's only got a few more days here, and it'd be a bit awkward to get out of it now. Damn. Oh, that's fine by me. I've only just finished taking those bloody exams. We have done the synopsis for the film. I mean, I wouldn't mind taking a bit of time off. So we'll start on Friday? Yes, right. It'll be a bit noisy, but we can shut ourselves away. Noisy? Yes, there's a fiesta, lots of dancing, fireworks and wine and things. Oh, I've never been to Spain before. Haven't you? Oh, well, you must then. You must go to the fiesta. Well, let's have a look at the diary. That brings us to Monday. So we'll start on Monday. No, but Monday and Tuesday are Connie's last 2 days, so I'd like to see her off at the airport on Wednesday. That would give us 2 days. Look, why don't we make it 2 weeks? Done. So we closed up our notebook, marked film, and went to the beach. I spent the next 2 weeks searching for something that I knew was probably very sexy. I hadn't telephoned my girlfriend, and she very likely wasn't going to come out, which was a bit of a relief in that I'd rather half-heartedly decided to marry her. A telegram arrived at the villa for Dr. G. Chapman. I realised that I'd passed the examinations. Click went a tape recorder playback button, and David said, "It was the 14th of July, and the campsite was full of French drunks going out as I returned. I was walking along the road back to the campsite, lined with poplars. I was saying good night to everyone in any language that seemed to suit their appearance. When I came to saying it in England, I think I was answered with good evening in English from Graham, and I first thought he was coming towards me from the campsite, but it turned out he'd been following me for some distance. He asked me what I was doing, and would I like to have a drink at the bar. He told me a strange concocted story about staying one night in the campsite before his room in a villa was ready. He said he'd seen me in town and trailed me a bit. We went to a bar by the swimming pool. He introduced himself, his work, and ordered 2 enormous double Bacardis and Cokes. We were very amused, making for instant rapport, by the antics of French people dressed in banana leaves, pushing each other into the pool, pouring wine over each other's heads, and bellowing every national anthem they knew. After quite a few drinks, click. Well, we had quite a polite conversation about the other occupants of the villa, who included, intriguingly, Marty Feldman of Round the Horn and his wife, more interesting to me than Cleese or Chapman. Then suddenly Graham asked if he could come and see my tent, which seemed eccentric from such a straight and ordinary-looking man. I genuinely had no idea until we got there, and he was supposedly surveying it, that he was actually going to grab me and give me a passionate kiss. That led to seeing the inside of the tent. I was totally amazed at the novelty of it to him. We didn't do anything devastating, but spent the time exploring each other. Great fun, not heavy and have your rocks off immediately. It was romantic. Still, it was a year before I could believe I wasn't being taken for a ride. Chapter 7. A Reincarnation. In the course of David Frost's one-day holiday in Ibiza, he checked up that John and I had actually been doing some writing, and even squawked at it, which we took for laughter, but he pointedly looked forward to reading more than 10 pages, and said that he thought it would be a good idea if John Cleese, Tim Brooke-Taylor, Marty Feldman, and myself did a TV comedy show together, and added that he was looking for something for Ronnie Corbett to do, remarking, "Perhaps you, Graham, and Barry Cryer would like to have a go at writing it, a kind of middle-class situation comedy. There hasn't really been one." That all sounded very good to me. Although I knew him, I'd never written with Barry before. How would it be if Eric Idle and Barry and myself were to write a programme for the series? "Super," said David, "super," and went off to frolic in the shallow waters. And so, what was to become The Rise and Rise of Michael Rimmer, later rewritten with Peter Cook, and at last the 1948 show, very much a progenitor of Python, and several series of Ronnie Corbett's No That's Me Over Here would never have happened if it hadn't been for 45 minutes of David Frost's enthusiasm and confidence prior to paddling. Between the first run of 7 and the second of 6 1948 shows, I was living with David in a flat in Hampstead. The Coming Out Party. 22 Gayton Crescent, 1960 thing. "Bring," said the telephone. "It's all right, David. I'll get it." "Bring," it opined again, but before I could stop him, David had picked up the handset and was answering. I rushed up, thumped him across the gob to stop him saying any more. "Who was that?" said my mother. "Oh, it was one of the painters," I said, knowing that she knew I was decorating my flat. "It sounded like one of the painters I've spoken to before." "Well, yes, it probably did a bit." "It's a bit late for a painter, isn't it?" No, you just don't understand London, Mother. This is not like Leicester." For a whole year I'd lived in terror, an almost Thorpian terror, of being found out for what I was, a poof. Fuck it, I thought. Why go through all this agony? I decided that I would invite my closest friends to a party to meet David and explain to them all that I was a bit bent. The agony of keeping silent had become too great. Having to explain to Marty, John and Tim that I had to rush off to St. Swithin's to cash a cheque when I should have been writing with them at 10 o'clock in the evening became boring, worrying and unnecessary. I thought, why hide something from intelligent people like that? I was ashamed that I wasn't admitting that Dave was my closest friend. He came to most of the recordings of the 1948 show and sat at the back anonymously in the audience, and couldn't come with all the other people's wives and girlfriends to the bar after the recordings. So, after a year, I decided that this party would be a good idea to get it all out into the open once and for all. I invited Marty, John, Tim, Eric Idle, Barry Cryer, Dick Vosper and Beryl, almost everyone I knew. I don't think David Frost could make it. He was in a meeting at the time. And even my ex-girlfriend and one or two other people from St. Swithin's. This was a coming-out party. We laid on a very good meal in our little basement flat, a buffet. We had splendid food and lots to drink, because I still felt a bit nervous about the occasion, and I thought I'd better get everyone pretty pissed before making, well, not an announcement, just wandering from group to group, explaining that this was David and introducing him. And that's what I did. It was interesting seeing various people's reactions to this. From Marty, it wasn't so much surprise as disbelief, but then laughter. Being an East End lad brought up in a theatrical family with a telluric wife, he wasn't worried about it at all. John Cleese already knew about it, because I thought that just to announce it to him, since he was one of my closest friends and we wrote together, would be tactless or even a form of betrayal. I'd actually told him about 2 nights before this party, so he wasn't surprised, but was still in a state of shock about it because it was totally alien to him. Such a thing was unthinkable, and this was going to be the ruin of my life. Although he was still friendly, he was completely at a loss to give his feelings. But his girlfriend at the time, Pippa, was a lot more understanding. I've often found that women are a lot more understanding about male homosexuality than men. Because I suppose men feel threatened in some way. I don't know what it is, but your average butch male is probably worried about certain tendencies and things that went on at school, and now so bleeding butch and grimly heterosexual that he wouldn't admit to such a thing even existing, except with scorn or in various puny jokes about people wearing pink and mincing around. The other reactions. Barry Cryer was fine. He took it all in his stride because of his previous showbiz background. He did write for Danny LaRue, after all. My ex-girlfriend, unfortunately, ran off in tears, accompanied by a couple of people from St. Swithin's, so that was a bit of an unhappy moment, but she came to terms with it eventually. The other extraordinary reaction was from Eric Idle, who was quite stunned. Obviously, he was quite young then, but I had to explain to him what it all meant, that I actually did go to bed with people of the same sex, and that it was quite fun, and we actually loved each other. It wasn't at all naughty. Now, of course, he's probably even more liberated than I am. Not in the same way, but in 750 other ways. I felt a lot better after the party, but it was about 2 years later than that before I could tell my parents, which was a very difficult moment. It was a waste of my time pretending, and a waste of their time worrying, so I told my mother that David was my boyfriend. I've never seen such rage, tears, stamping of little feet. It took me quite a long time to calm her down. Luckily, I was fortified on quite a lot of gin and tonic, and was determined in my mind that everything was all right. I'd been in at the inception of the gay liberation movement in this country, and so had a pretty solid idea that what I was doing was not wrong, and that to love another human being of whatever sex is surely an admirable thing. I wasn't taking any more, and while she was having her little fit, I stood firm and told her to shut up, that it was all pointless. She had known David for a couple of years, and neither of us had done any harm to the other. Still, she screamed. Eventually she calmed down, and then I said, "Right, I'm going to tell Dad." That started her up again. "Oh, no, don't, it'll kill him." "It won't kill him, of course it won't kill him." "Yes, it will, it'll kill him. Of course it won't, shut up. I'm going to tell him." But eventually she persuaded me that it might have some adverse effect on him and made me promise not to tell him. So they went home, my mother pretending that nothing had happened at all. She spent the next 7 nights completely sleepless until eventually my father forced it out of her and said, "Look, what the hell's the matter with you?" She explained to my father, who took it all in his stride. I was on my way back from some show I was doing in the north of England and was going to call in to see them in Leicester. I was too late, really, to call in and get back to London on time, so I rang them up from a motorway service station and explained that I couldn't call. At the end of the conversation, my father said, "Oh, Graham, your mother's been a bit upset this last week, and I know what it's about. Look, don't worry about it. She just doesn't understand these things." I felt fine. That was good. Thereafter, David has been like another son to them, and they've been absolutely splendid ever since. But it's very difficult for people to break that kind of news to their parents. They should. What's the point of hiding things and telling lies? Suddenly, I feel like digressing for another moment about morality. I intend to publish here for the first time what I believe to be a missing portion of the New Testament. The papyrus manuscript, translated here from the original Greek, was discovered in 1979 by the author at Auckland Airport. He was there in transit to Sydney, Australia, on the 5th of November, whiling away a few moments, idly looking under rocks, when the manuscript was given to him by a Maori chieftain toilet attendant. The manuscript contained 2 leaves of an Alexandrian text type similar to the Beatty Biblical Papyrus 2P46. But this was probably written by a scribe whose native tongue was Coptic. Once the misspellings and iticisms are corrected, it closely resembles the Greek of the earlier Alexandrian witnesses. The first epistle of Paul the Apostle to the New Zealanders, AD 59, chapter 1, in which Paul castigateth the Antipodeans, empty showing of holiness, of fornicators and abusers of mankind, of poverty and tolerance, exhorteth them to beware of false prophets. Dear New Zealanders, it has come to my attention from our brother Hilary, the beekeeper of Auckland, that all is not well in your community. What is all this nonsense about certain of your number kneeling down in front of crosses? That is naughty in the extreme. You've changed the glory of an incorruptible God into an image. I understand that the very same people collect together in churches for the purpose of worship. Who needs it? God doesn't. I've asked him. He's fed up with it, especially the Psalms. They give him a headache and cause his teeth to strike together. Don't they realize their praise is meaningless? Why can't they concentrate on being better behaved towards one another and forget about this empty show of holiness? He says, though don't quote me on this, they can stuff it up their arses. He said that, not I. I, a mere mortal, would not have put it quite like that. I'm afraid I think too much about my earthly reputation, but I cannot help agreeing with him. About fornicators, adulterers, effeminates, and abusers of mankind, I'm constantly being misquoted on this point. I would like to state quite clearly that sex is nothing more than a way in which two or more people can have lots of harmless, cheap fun, provided that they are clean and that the aim is not reproduction. The betterment of the lot of mankind is impossible without strict limits on reproduction, so don't make the mistake the rest of the world has made and overpopulate yourselves. Not everyone has to have children for Christ's sake. He didn't have any, and I should know. If you really feel you have to have children, then make sure that as parents you have no more than you can properly look after. I don't know how all this nonsense about counting souls got started. It just leads to overcrowding and poverty. Look, poverty isn't all it's cracked up to be. I think the old needle, rich man, camel story is being misunderstood out of context. Of course, worrying about earthly possessions makes it difficult to concentrate on spiritual things, but, dear friends, isn't it also difficult to concentrate on spiritual things if you're an ill-nourished, diseased down-and-out? The deprived may also become the depraved. I've had a lot of trouble with this poverty idea in Rome, where the notion unfortunately seems to be catching on that the church should be richer than anyone else on the grounds that only they can handle it. Peter, for instance, scared Ananias and Sapphira to death for hard cash in the name of the church. I said to him, now that wasn't very Christ-like, was it? And he told me to get stuffed, as he was a super-apostle. You seem to have made more progress in stamping out the primitive tribal mutilation of circumcision than they have in the more venal communities, yet it is still recommended, so the beekeeper tells me, by some wretched physicians who seek to line their pockets or cling to their Judaic ancestry. Talking of tribes, from what I've heard, there could still be more understanding and tolerance between the two main tribes in your islands. I hope this is heeded more than my letter to the Tasmanians. I exhort you to be empathetic, be splendid, be aware of your own ignorance, and, as always, beware of those who claim to lead you to better self-knowledge by taking your money. Must finish now, as I have to catch the post. Lots of love, P. Kiss, kiss, kiss. Chapter 8. 2 Films and 6 Snakes. In the spring of 1960 splunge, John Cleese and Graham Chapman thought they might like to do another television programme. In another part of London, Michael Palin, Terry Jones, and Eric Idle, and an American draft dodger, and who can blame him, called Terry Vance Gilliam, thought they would too. Their last show had been a zany, wacky, dappy-dippy, off-the-wall, over-the-carpet, through the French windows and into the garden show, which included the splendid Bonzo Dog Doodah Band with his pauntliness Neil Innes. This effort was a children's programme called Do Not Adjust Your Set. Barry Took, an ex-writing partner of Marty Feldman, conceived the notion that perhaps 6 of us could produce an intercoursingly good show. I was unaware of this at the time, but I have been told that one of the strong reasons for the amalgamation of the 2 groups was John Cleese's, shall I say, affection for Mikey, as he calls him, Palin. But I know nothing of these things, and he certainly doesn't. This, then, was the beginning of our stretching time, the toad elevating moment, a horse, a bucket, and a spoon, sex and violence, circus, flying circus, Gwen Dibley's flying circus, and eventually Monty Python's flying circus. And now, Python. I remember not being particularly interested in the debate about titles, and wouldn't have minded if the programme had been called Lizard, in that the contents of the programme were more important than the title. Had I given up medicine for trivia such as this? Me. I still like owl stretching time. Of course, it was my idea. Terry Jones. And lots of noises only the Welsh can make. I still like a horse, a bucket, and a spoon, his suggestion. J. Cleese. Look, you Welsh git, we discarded that about 2 hours ago. Terry Jones. Oh, fucking hell! Throwing papers to the floor. Aren't we able to talk about things? J. Cleese. Yes, but do we have to go on and on about it in such a high-pitched voice? John Cleese guffaws like a barrister, having made his point. This winds Terry Jones up to near violence. Of course I go on about it. It's fucking important. J. Cleese patronisingly, "Terry, would you or would you not say that the rest of us have already agreed that we don't like it?" A heavy glass ashtray is flung across the room, narrowly missing J. Cleese. Characteristic of his temperament, T. Jones calms down instantly, having vented his spleen on inanimate objects. G. Chapman, "I still like our stretching time." M. Palin, "No, I've gone off that a bit. I prefer sex and violence. But I do think Terry's got a point about a horse, a bucket and a spoon." J. Cleese, "Oh, come off it." And so it was decided to call it Monty Python's Flying Circus. The BBC thought it was getting another in a long line of unsuccessful late-night ex-undergraduate satire shows. They were trying to find a successor to That Was the Week That Was, and they still are. We didn't know what we expected to give them until we'd written it, but we knew that we weren't going to give them topical jokes, spoofs on political leaders, or trenchant vignettes about life in Northwest 1 London. We were fed up with the traditional well-shaped sketch, the beginning, middle, and the inevitable punchline. We wanted to be free to hang on to an idea for just 3 seconds, or a whole half hour if we felt like it. Despite its faults, the BBC hadn't succumbed to timid vapidity in those days, and gave us a series of 13 programmes to do, without demanding to see a script or pilot programme. And very gradually, they allowed us to do more and more outdoor filming. The style, if there is one, developed because we were the people we are. Ian McNaughton, a tousle-haired, loopy Scottish person, was to be our director. Ethanol was a common bond between Ian and myself, and I also liked his knack of getting things done while surrounded by apparent total chaos. "Let's have a drink, Hen, you know what I mean. Jesus Christ, they must grumble, but we'll get twice as much fucking usable film in the can a day as most of these other BBC poonaggers. Don't you think so, Graham?" "I do. Let's have another." "Aye." The meticulous, orderly side of John Cleese's nature, the side that counts how many O, A and S levels and what sort of degree a person has got, as in some way definitive of that person's all-round ability, was uncomfortable with some of Ian's character traits, particularly Ian's friendliness, which made John freeze and resort to schoolmasterly sarcasm. Terry Jones wanted to direct everything that Ian was directing, but Ian was very tolerant, and I feel that Ian never really got enough credit for his part in the creation of Monty Python's Flying Circus. I had a mad year which I shall never forget, in which I wrote or co-wrote 37 half-hour TV comedy scripts. That may seem a lot, and is, so you'll have to forgive me. There were 13 Python programmes for which I was writing with John Cleese, a series of 13 for Ronnie Corbett, for which I wrote with Barry Cryer, and 11 episodes of Doctor at Large, which I wrote with Bernard McKenna. But of course, the really heroic part is not the sheer number of script, but what Bengalis call quality. There is no English equivalent for this colourful Oriental usage, meaning literally quailness. Quails in Bengal are a great delicacy, so an object of great quality is equal in value to a large number of quails. The nearest English idiom would be good thingness, but that does not quite catch the suggestive essence of the original. Anyway, I will have to leave it to more modest people than myself to deny that all 37 were reasonably good. I went to one office for Barry Cryer in the morning, to another in the afternoon for Bernard McKenna, and then spent the evening writing with John Cleese. Everyone, apart from Barry, thought I was being lazy. It was fun, and I was pissed most of the time. I had to be because of the sheer strain of it. Much of that tightly pissed period is still a binful of blurred memories. The years that followed remain so similarly, which is an excellent excuse for a few disordered snatches. Extremely heavy petting in the back of a taxicab with 4 Chinese friends, reaching a climax as we drove through Swiss Cottage towards Belsize Park, a mere prelude to a night of neuronic concupiscence. Keith Moon and I went to meet Harry Nilsson at the Mermaid Theatre where Harry's The Point was playing. In the crowded bar, at Harry's request, Keith's minder, Richard, demonstrated his art by kicking a cigarette out of Harry's mouth. You would have missed the action in half an eye blink. I also remember waking up on the floor of the first-class lounge of a Boeing 747 at 35,000 feet, not knowing how I'd got there, where I was going to, or where I'd come from, and not caring. But all that is so much hot air behind the fridge. "Behind the fridge?" squawks Lady Bracknell. "Oh, come on," hisses Bernard Palin. "We're still waiting." But my mind is elsewhere. Chapter 9. John of the Antarctic. One January night in 1972, I lay languidly draped over the comfortable deep red Chesterfield. I listened to the tiny clangs as bubbles of carbon dioxide effervesced their way past my ear to burst at the top of a quadruple glass of gin and slimline tonic with ice but no lemon in. I relaxed in the sheer lack of austerity in this, the largest room in my penthouse in Belsize Park. Banks of spotlights focused harsh geometric slabs of magenta, emerald green and beige across the walls, while from a thurible effused frangipani, bergamot and chypre, compounding a mirantic furor of didantilism. From some 43 feet away I could barely make out the distant drone of my brother, who is, after all, a surgeon, examining a friend of mine. This friend had an umbilical hernia I thought needed attention. His examination complete, my brother agreed, and we set about making the arrangement for his admission to hospital, when the telephone rang, and a voice said, "Is that Dr. Graham Chapman?" "Yes," I riposted. "Ah," said the voice, "you're just down as Chapman Dr. G in the book. I just wanted to check. I've got a young man staying with me who's quite ill. He's got a high fever, but he refuses to go to hospital or see my doctor. He says that he's met you. You gave him your autograph once. He says he would see you." "Who is that?" You wouldn't know if I told you, but it's Richard Milner." "You were right," I told the voice, "and that the best thing would be to wrap him up well and bring him round, as we seem to be holding a mini-surgery in my flat that evening anyway." Half an hour later he arrived, a good-looking young man, introducing himself as John Tomichek. I'd seen him outside a Kensington restaurant. The long dark hair, olive complexion, bright blue fur-lined jacket, and blue and maroon trousers jogged the memory. I showed him into the main room and took a brief history. He was 17 years old, from Liverpool, and in London, staying with a friend, while waiting to take up some sort of apprenticeship with a shoe firm. He had had 2 similar attacks of fever at roughly monthly intervals, but this was the worst yet. He also complained of tiredness, general muscle pains, and headache. My brother examined him, and finding enlargement of the superficial lymph nodes, considered glandular fever, or infectious mononucleosis if you would prefer, though why you should I don't know, the most likely diagnosis. The fever at monthly intervals sounded more ominous, however, reminiscent of a Pell-Ebstein fever found in the more serious condition of Hodgkin's disease, a lymphadenoma if you'd prefer that. We decided immediate hospitalization would be wise, and with the aid of his efficaciousness A.R. Bailey physician, had him admitted to the Royal Northern Hospital for bed rest and the appropriate clinical tests. The tests confirmed the diagnosis of glandular fever and showed that he'd had a fairly severe infection which had affected his liver. 2 weeks later, the ambulance service rang me to say, "We've got a John Robert Tomichek here who's only given us your address. Since you had him admitted, where should we take him?" They actually sounded busier than that. "Bring him here," I said, thinking, well, we can sort everything out between ourselves. John arrived and certainly looked better, though still pale and weak. He was rather non-committal about this friend he'd been staying with, Richard Milner. I thought that rather than have him going off, popping into pubs, doing further damage to his liver, perhaps a short convalescence with us would be wise. We did have a spare room. I asked him about his family and background, but because of his strong Liverpool accent and an ability to feel less well whenever he was questioned, I let things ride, thinking, well, he'll tell us when he's ready. Meantime, we shall make sure he eats well and continues to recover. This proved difficult, and he only ate fish and chips and jam butties, but 4 weeks later he had indeed recovered. I'd just finished an intense writing stint and thought that a weekend away would be a good idea, and so it was that David, Andrew, my Irish-Portuguese chauffeur, John and I set off to go to North Wales. I'd equipped all of them with climbing boots, anoraks, etc., and at last had a team who would come climbing with me. It was an uneventful journey, apart from a major accident when a 25-ton truck drove into the side of my Vandenplas Princess at 50 miles an hour. Fortunately, the car bore the blow pretty well, and we were able to continue our journey. There were 2 doors on the other side of the car, after all. Rather later than I'd hoped that night, we checked into the Pennygrith Hotel at the foot of Mount Snowdon. It was February, and Snowdon can be a difficult proposition in the winter, but we were well equipped: ice axes, ropes, carabiners, space blankets, emergency rations, the lot. The next morning, when we set out from the Penny Pass, there were patches of blue in the sky and the air was crisp. Up above us, Crib Goch, the first peak in the Snowdon group we were about to climb, stood covered in cloud down to just about the snow line. We would have at least 1,000 feet of snow and ice to tackle before reaching its summit. From Crib Goch I was hoping to complete half the Snowdon Horseshoe by going on to the top of the highest peak and then to make our return to base coming down via the easy pig track. I think John was a little alarmed at the number of people he saw coming down, having failed to get up. I was slightly apprehensive myself, but confident that there was nothing 4 young fit men couldn't take on. At one point there was a tricky little slab of rock covered with ice, which in the cloud gave the appearance of being steeper than it actually was. John was worried by this at first, but I lowered a rope to him to make sure that he got up safely. We very rarely needed to cut steps and made good time up to the summit itself. The ridge extending from Crib Goch to the main body of Snowdon is a narrow one, and in these conditions represented a knife edge of rock covered with ice. Steep snow slopes fell precipitously on either side, disappearing into the cloud below. It was appallingly cold, way below zero, and the wind tore at us, showering us with spicules of ice. Suddenly everything went crimson, with little gussets of gamboge, but Evans knew what Scott was thinking. That Ballyman Oates has been a pain in the neck ever since we hit Antarctica 9 months ago. The frost over Evans' eyebrows and icicles in his beard can't hide the fact, thought Scott, that Evans' lips, though green with cold, would, if they could, have said what he knew him to be thinking. Oates was a bore, an unmitigated, crushing bore. Whatever possessed them to accept such a fellow in the first place? Well, he's nipped out for a moment for one of his boring little walks. He'll be back in a minute, screaming odes at us at the top of his voice over the howl of the wind. The 2 men stared at each other, then, acting like 2 men, crawled out and dismantled the tent, ran off, and piled it onto the back of the sledge. The sledge, covered with the bodies of the dead dogs whom they later intended to give a decent English burial, was heavy, but the thought of Oates quoting "a thing of beauty is a" made them pull even harder, and they broke into a jog as the thought of Oates' premature return struck them both. Soon they were miles away, safely encamped again, making up stories about how brave Oates had been, walking out like that, saying, "I'm just going out for a walk," though really we both knew how he considered himself as a burden on us. Tee-hee-hee, they both thought, until they didn't. Almost as suddenly everything went white, and we were progressing along the ridge, for safety in the high wind, quite often sitting astride it, with one leg hanging either side. We were getting along slowly, but safely, and I was thankful for the cloud. If any of the party had seen the drop on either side, they might have been as worried as I was. We came to the end of the first part of the ridge, and the going became easier, but I thought we'd better abandon our original plan and get down sooner. I was thinking of safety and the pub opening hours. I decided to take a more direct route down a gully to our left. To make a quicker descent, I unroped the whole team for the climb down the snow slope. John, thinking, what a relief, it's all over, we're down the dangerous bit, leapt off ahead. I stopped him, and we all roped up again. I knew that steady progress was better than haste, because at the bottom of these couloirs, what in summer is a waterfall, in winter becomes a miniature glacier. Sure enough, when we got to the point where the waterfall should have been, there was an ice floe. I had to cut steps down it carefully. It took about an hour and a half to get down the ice slope, but as soon as we were at the bottom of it, we were almost on the snow line, scattered patches of snow and rocks above a scree. On easier ground again, we unroped. We could actually see the pig track 300 feet or so below us. John again set off rather too quickly, and I shouted at him to slow down. Unfortunately, he had picked up so much momentum he couldn't stop, tripped, and somersaulted about 35 feet down the mountainside. In the process, he cut his forehead and collected some chest abrasions and a possible fractured left leg. We climbed down to him and tried to carry him, but the pain from the leg was soon too much for him to bear. I stayed with him, wrapped him in space blankets and patched up his forehead with surgical tape, sending David and Andrew down with our map reference to get the mountain rescue team. The weather was too foul for the helicopter to fly, and so we had to wait for the RAF mountain rescue team to come on foot. Even though we were much lower down the mountain than we had been, it was still extremely cold, and by now darkness had fallen. A high wind and driving snow enhanced the sense of danger. I had a torch and a whistle, and began SOS signalling, but John and I had to wait there for 4 hours before any sign of rescue. Another party, loosely fitting our description, 2 men, 1 young with a broken leg, had fallen lower down the mountainside. The RAF picked them up and thought they'd rescued us. They hadn't. The team arrived back at base, and there waited an anxious David and Andrew. "It's okay, we've got them," said the RAF. David looked at the faces and said, "That's not Graham, and that's not John either." The RAF team set out again, with David showing the route of our descent. 4 hours at minus temperatures in the dark somewhere on a mountainside is a bit telling on the spirit and strength. John wasn't too bad, as some of the other climbers had stopped on their way down and provided extra blankets. I was worried. I continued blowing my whistle and flashing the torch at intervals, as you're supposed to, and waited for a return signal. Wonderful. I heard their whistle way below and to the left of us. I increased my blowing. A marvellous moment this. I heard a distant shout. They must have seen my light. I saw their light quickly return my flash. That was fan-bloody-tastic. All thoughts of what eternity smells like had vanished. They climbed up to us and gave me some hot soup as John was carefully strapped onto a tubular alloy mountain rescue stretcher. Then we had to lower him down the mountainside. Quite a big team is involved in these kind of operations. You have to have one person going down in front to work out the best route, a couple of bearers at the front of the stretcher, 3 on either side, and a team of about 8 others hanging onto ropes behind so that the stretcher can be lowered down crags and cliffs. Being a non-injured party, I was naturally expected to help, and so took my place hanging onto the ropes at the back. I was so exhausted I couldn't help for long. My hands couldn't grip any more, and I kept stumbling. The last 300 feet down were too much for me. I gave up and said, sorry, I can't help any more, and slid down the rest of the way on my arse. I couldn't even walk. It was appalling. Once the stretcher party reached the footpath, they set off at a quicker pace. One of the RAF team stayed behind with me just to make sure I didn't stagger into the lake, which was almost exactly near 0 degrees centigrade as you can get without water actually being ice. The unfortunate thing was that what is normally a causeway across the lake, Lyn Podan, in the winter isn't. It is 4 feet deep in ice-cold water, either side of which, should you step off, is 40 feet of ice-cold water, which isn't good for anyone's health. Either that, or you go round the lake, a 4-mile-long slog. I didn't want to go 4 miles, as opposed to 100 yards, neither did the man with me. But we had to cross that lake, guided only by the lights of the Land Rover on the other side. It was pitch black, and if we'd slipped off either side, we'd both have been dead, no doubt about that. We got across, up to the waist in my case, in ice-cold water, at the end of what had been a rather long day. David had by now crossed it 3 times. We arrived back at the Penigurith Hotel, and John was taken off to hospital. We discovered that all the residents had been listening to the rescue on shortwave radio because the owner of the hotel, Chris Briggs, used to be a mountain rescue organizer. His hotel, after all, was the base for the training of the Everest team. We got back there to, well, it wasn't thunderous applause, but it was a lot of interest because they'd all been listening to the rescue in progress. The rescue team had no time to receive thank-you drinks. They were already out scouring the peaks for 3 more missing climbers. Anyway, John had been taken off to Bangor Hospital. David and Andrew and I felt we deserved several pints of beer and quite a few scotches, a meal and more scotches, only to be rung up at about 11 o'clock by Bangor Hospital, who said that the young man called John Tomicek was refusing to stay in hospital. I asked them about the x-rays, whether they'd x-rayed his head because of the injury to it. They had, no signs of damage, and his leg only had a hairline fracture. I thought, he's had a hell of a day anyway, and obviously wants to be with his friends. I told them, send him round to the Penigurith Hotel and I'll do a head chart on him. We can have him back to you in 20 minutes if anything goes wrong. This meant checking his pulse, pupils, blood pressure and breathing rate regularly. The next morning, the local police came round to the hotel wanting to see me and asked, who is this John Tomicek? What do you know about him? I told them the story of how I came to meet John and how he came to be with us. They then said, what would you say if we told you he's 14 years old and has been missing from home for 9 months? I said I'd tell you exactly what I just have. That's what happened. If it had not been so, the word kidnapping would spring to mind, but I'd been trying to find out where his parents were, etc., etc. What had happened, of course, because of the routine police check-up on mountain rescue, was that they'd actually found out his home address, and his father was coming to collect him. He was a bit late in arriving. It's not far from Liverpool to the Penigurith, about a 2-hour drive, but his father took 5. I thought, if that was a son of mine, I'd have been there in a flash. But after I'd queried his delay with a raised eyebrow, John's father and I got on rather well. We both came to the conclusion that if he were taken back to Huyton, Liverpool, he would only run away again. John's mother had died some 5 years ago, and his father had 4 other children to look after on his own. A proud man, understandably, he did not want institutional care for them. John had been asked to leave one rather strict Roman Catholic grammar school and was a persistent truant at another. We asked him, would you go back to school if you stayed in London? Yes, said John. So, informally, he became my ward, and I his guardian.
End of side 3.
An odd feeling, suddenly becoming the parent of a teenager. All my paternal instincts emerged. Suddenly it was exactly as if John were my son. Before returning to London, John went to stay with his father for a couple of weeks. We were going to Jersey to do some Python filming, and John arrived back in London in time to join me on that trip. I was very pleased to see him, and so was David. Our flat was his home. The local Nick, the Hampstead Nick, rang that very morning and said, "We'd like to have a talk to you, Dr. Chapman, about the John Tomichek business." I said, Oh, well, all right. "Shall we come up to your place?" No, I'll come up to the police station, don't worry," I told them. "As it happens, John's here at the moment. He's just arrived." "Is he? Well, you'd better bring him too." John and I both went up to the police station. We had about 3 hours before catching the plane for Jersey, and we were kept there for 2 being questioned, John being rather more fiercely interrogated than I. After all, I was a doctor. A rather nervous Sergeant Green of the CID, the Hampstead Perverts branch, was questioning me. Eventually, he plucked up courage. "There's one thing I do have to ask, Dr. Chapman," after a long pause. "Are you a homosexual?" I said, "Yes." He was expecting the more convenient answer, "No." And then everything would have been all right. We would just have gone. But having had several articles published in which I stated that I was a homosexual, I didn't feel I could say no, and I couldn't honestly say no anyway. But obviously they had to check to make sure nothing was going on between John and myself. They then tried to get in contact with his father and eventually reached him by telephone and said to him, "I gather you've given permission for your son John to go to Jersey with Graham Chapman." His father said, "Yes, that's true." The police then said, "Did you know that Dr. Chapman was a homosexual?" And he said, "Yes." And then there was nothing they could do, much against their better judgment. We just caught our plane to Jersey. It may surprise the police, but I happen to believe, along with every homosexual that I've ever met, that it is antisocial and insensitive in the extreme for anyone of whatever sex to attempt to force any sort of physical attention on another person. John had found a stable, happy home and soon had a circle of friends at his new school. Apart from my being a bad influence in that my drinking habits encouraged him to drink too much, I think David and I have done a pretty good job, and we're proud of him. Chapter 10. A Python Stage Tour. The tour was going well, a success everywhere. I'd pulled in Southampton, Oxford, and even Cardiff. I'd expected Cardiff to be a bit of a challenge, but full of gin and the feeling of superiority over mortals which commonly afflicts the adulated, I had reached my zenith in a naughty and to this day illegal act upon the floor of an empty dressing-room. The fact that this romance blossomed from love at first sight right through to mopping up in the 10 minutes available between Acts 1 and 2 of Monty Python's first farewell tour merely seemed like a good idea at the time, Your Honour. Pressure of work, previously unimpeachable character, etc., etc. Sorry, where was I? Merely seemed to add piquancy to the occasion. However, Sunderland was a toughie. Only 2 entries in the Gay Guide. Open summer weekends only. No point in even trying, I thought, on a Wednesday night in March. And so, for the first time, I went with the others to eat after the show. But then I never felt happy in a place unless I'd scored. This thought nagged as I drank my way through the meal. I watched the others being interested in eating, chatting with their wives and non-wives. I had more to drink and decided to cross Sunderland off the map. On my way past the reception desk, I said, "Good grief, there's no one to go to bed with. Where are all the young men around here? This is absolutely dreadful." I went to my room and fell drunkenly onto the bed alone. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning to find the night porter in bed with me, nude. He wasn't particularly my choice of person, but in the circumstances he was welcome. He had let himself in with a pass-key and, faithful to the hotelier's code, put customer satisfaction first. The satisfaction was mutual, and I even found myself wanting to stay in Sunderland, because, as things would have it, most of the junior staff apparently had similar devotion to duty. After Sunderland, we spent the weekend in Dallas, Texas, the birthplace of Python in the States. Odd that our television shows were first screened on the public broadcasting service of a town which was looked upon generally as a bit right-wing.
We were there to assist in a fundraising week for that particular TV station, and I was there to get laid. This time I got lucky with a Red Indian. After the glitter of the TV show, it was wham-bam straight back to his place, a 10-foot by 6 lean-to with good stereo and curious rats at the back of a garage in a part of town tourists don't get to see. Wonderful. Back to the tour of England. We stopped off at Windermere for a night on our way down from Glasgow. A reporter did an interview with Mike, Eric and myself in my room. We all went out to eat, but I got bored with eating. I wanted sex, sex, sex. Walked halfway round Lake Windermere, lifeless, not a soul. I went back to my room in the hotel to go to bed. There was a knock on the door. It was the interviewer. He said, "Sorry to disturb you, I seem to have left my microphone." I said, "I bet you only did that so you could go to bed with me." He said, "Oh, all right." Whammo zap! There was no holding me now, stark staring, raving mad. New York was fun city. How about that time in Raffles Bar? A good-looking Puerto Rican. Vroom! Straight into the telephone booth with him. Didn't give a damn. We were young and in love. For 3 whole minutes we grappled with each other, but, out of concern to the other patrons of the bar, we left the door of the booth open. If we'd closed it, the lights would have gone on. 35,000 feet up in the air with an Eskimo in the toilet of a Boeing 74... Stop! Stop this! Stop it! I've no idea which one of you co-authors wrote this. It is out of place, inaccurate, and rather strong. Don't you think we should build up more steadily from childhood sweethearts via light to heavy petting with girls, thoughts of marriage, etc.? You know very well there's not a shred of truth in it. Why should we take the risk of offending the vast majority of people who, quite justifiably, take offence at offensive things? Sorry. Anyway, we left Sunderland far behind, and as our Range Rover sped us on our way to Edinburgh at a cool 120 miles an hour on the hard shoulder with hazard lights flashing, I handed the bottle of Glenfiddich back to the curiously pallid hitchhiker, saying, "I can't understand why no one else is using this lane," and marvelled at the splendid unpredictability of life. In Edinburgh, I was very naughty indeed. 2 young... Look, I'm afraid I'm just going to have to stop this chapter. Chapter 11. More touring. Throughout Monty Python's tremendously successful tour of Canada, my behaviour was exemplary. Oh, that's much better. I met some delightful people and made many friends, including some local dignitaries. Meanwhile, a short time away, the scene changes to Monastir, Tunisia. Several years later, the same century, about tea time. I wander down to the hotel swimming pool, order a 7-Up, never expecting it to arrive, and lie down in the fierce, unrelenting sun next to the nude Brazilian lady with the fierce, unrelenting breasts, and write this in a book. For 8 weeks, I am playing Brian and the unit medical person. Brian is the central character in the film and is involved in almost every scene. But it is the people around him who do the funny things and have the funny things done to them. I am trying to play the unit medical person in much the same way. The first few days in Tunisia had their salt-tabletic, lomotylitic and occasionally streptotriaditic moments, but were mostly spent on being Brian. Work on the first scene started at 7 a.m. and took 12 hours in direct sunlight. It was 95 degrees in the shade at 9 a.m., made hotter by 2 huge arc lamps directed straight into our faces. Add to that the fact that this scene was being shot so that it would look as though it were taking place at night, and you have a disorientation and mental and physical torture not permitted in wartime. I was grateful that for the first few days rumours that I was medically qualified were treated with mild disbelief, and that I was generally regarded as one of the most unhinged of one of the world's maddest groups. My successes with the little pink tablets, however, were quick to blab, and word got round that diarrhoea wasn't caused by the weather, nor was it an essential part of being in Tunisia. I was beginning to think things were a bit dull, and was idly thumbing through some common medical emergencies to refresh my mind how to deal with such fascinating problems as embalming at sea, rabies in charcuterie accidents, and medico-legal aspects of hired camel-bite fatalities, when I had to deal with a patient whose successful treatment established the medical person as being altogether a more important character than Brian. He was a designer from the art department who had been ill since arrival. He had been seen by the local doctor and was getting worse. His girlfriend explained in pulverized English that the doctor had said that he had a virus in the tummy and a pressure of 12, and that he must eat only carrots and rice. He had been given intramuscular aspirin injections by a friend of theirs who was a nurse, but she apparently couldn't be found, and the doctor was expensive. I found my patient in a stifling, darkened room, lying motionless, pale, and staring blankly at the ceiling, preparing to join the choir invisible. My first thought was to nip back and read up on notification of death on foreign soil, but in a lighter, breezier room he looked more like an ill rather than a very ill man of 32. I was relieved to find that he could speak with difficulty, the difficulty and the relief being that on examination I found that really he had tonsillitis. Penicillin brought back his temperature to normal, and a more varied diet and the encouragement of the thought that the end was not nigh did the rest. After that, I had a regular evening surgery with on-the-set follow-up clinics. I support Terry Jones in championing natural, unprocessed foodstuffs when we are all safe in our aseptic isle, but I wished he would consider the Mediterranean as a sea processed by man's personal and industrial waste. Then perhaps he would have spent less time urging unit members to eat ethnic, and they would have spent less time sitting in lavatories. The Brazilian ladies' breasts are still without relent, but they have definitely shrunk. Shrunk, in comparison, that is, with the smug, huge, crude milkers now surrounding me. Suddenly at the poolside the atmosphere is chill, as though a BBC TV interviewer was strolling casually up behind me to ask if I would mind if we would just... The Canadian tour over, I went for a few drinks in Los Angeles. I'd been guided from the tiny forward drinking compartment of a Boeing 747 down a perilous spiral staircase into a coma which had been waiting for me on the tarmac. The coma had evidently whisked me to a room in what I knew to be a hotel. My house in Highgate had shoddy room service and fewer Hyatt ashtrays. Several gin and tonics with ice but no limes in them later, I was able to walk about as well as a newborn giraffe. A few more G&Ts, and I was steady enough to hold a glass and turn off body buddies. Through the window, I could see that I was no longer wherever I had been, whenever it was. 213 area code. That meant Los Angeles. And I rang down to the lobby to see if I'd checked in and whether I was in a party or not. Los Angeles, I thought, and ordered a huge limo. The driver demurred at first, but then obeyed, and we drove sedately to a restaurant I'd heard about. It was, embarrassingly, opposite to the hotel. Sitting down to breakfast off nuts and gin, I looked around at people lunching at other tables. One of them, who may well have been a Scientologist, was rash enough to comment on my choice of breakfast. I dimly recalled uttering a few strange but applicable adjectives before and while being dragged up the steps and hurled onto the pavement. The novelty of being thrown out of establishment up the steps made me forget to question why they hadn't thrown out the Scientologist. The limo driver, who had never liked the restaurant in the first place, warmed to me and wafted me off to a place he thought would suit my mood, called the Polo Lounge. Looking round the room, I must have had some uncharitable thoughts about how much the occupants cared about the rest of the world. I met a friend who seemed to have been made to feel ill at ease, but after a few G&Ts I grew expansive and felt fit enough to feign paraplegia. The staff coped with the situation gracefully, and only became slightly ruffled when I explained that my paralysis was merely a joke, but one which, nevertheless, I was playing to the hilt. In no way was I going to move from the waist down, and so a wheelchair was brought, and helped by my driver, who was enjoying himself, and by the staff, none of whom were, I was scooped up and wheeled outside to the car. Here, overhearing a grumble from one of the staff, I ordered them to stop, fell out of the wheelchair, and dragged myself the last few yards, using arms only, into the back seat of the limo, absolutely refusing help. I went back to my hotel and changed my name at the desk. After a couple of days drinking in my room, Harry and Keith had to leave. As I was saying goodbye to them in the hotel lobby, a Californian sun-chick, lissom, bronzed limbs, pert breasts and golden flowing hair, said, "Hi." I said, "Hello," and asked Harry, "Who's that?" "I don't know, I thought she was with you." "Perhaps she is," I said. "Shall we go up to my room?" "Sure," she said. My suite at the Continental Hyatt also contained my one-time financial advisor, Major Sloane. He was on the telephone in his own room, and his eyes bulged as I showed Eve through to my bedroom. This compelling lass carried a straw bag, which, it transpired, contained a cerebrum-jangling erotopharmacopoeia of unguents, oils, and embrocations. My entire body was pampered The scent of exotic oils hung in the air as her sensuous, probing hands worked their magic. That was fun, I thought, after Eve had finished having her way and had blown her a goodbye kiss. I relaxed quietly, gulping at a gin and tonic, and wondered if there were any more like her down in the lobby. Zoom! In the lobby, a young girl came up to ask me if there was another telephone in the hotel. Sure, use the one in my room, I said, as I already began to propel her towards the elevator. But it's my mother who wants to use it. Well, bring her up too, I said magnanimously. I don't mind if it's a local call. There was no stopping me now. Major Sloane was still on the telephone, this time to one of his daughters whose birthday it was. That's nice, dear. What else did Mummy give you? His entire head pucened and his exophthalmos worsened, as the mother, quite unconcerned by the activity her daughter was engaged in, gratefully used my telephone, while in full sight of her and the bulging Major Sloane, I pushed my rampant...
Stop it! Stop this! Stop it! Stop it!
Chapter 12. A penultimate chapter. George Melly did a series of late-night chat shows for Granada Television, and his idea was to have guests who were really friends, so that there would be no need for a clipboard full of questions prepared by researchers, just George and his guest. He kindly invited me onto the programme. I remember the pre-show hospitality was particularly lavish, and the interview suitably outrageous. I finished up trying to train the audience to play shitties. Some weeks later, a letter arrived at the Python office via the BBC television centre. This was from an extremely angry lady who said that someone from Monty Python, who had not had the courage to give his name — I didn't need to, George had introduced me, and there it was in the closing credits — had appeared on the George Melly programme and had admitted to being homosexual. Her handwriting became visibly angrier as she went on to say that persons like that should not be allowed to live and should suffer eternal torment in the fires of hell and were an abomination. There was much more self-righteous invective, promising more fire and brimstone, followed up by some 20 pages of prayers which, if they were repeated by the offender twice daily, would place him in some kind of purgatory instead. Eric Idle had a marvellous idea and wrote back to the lady saying that we've found out which one it was and we've killed him. Curiously enough, we did the next TV series without John Cleese. I wonder what she thought. Several years earlier, there was a charity football match. M. Python and some others were playing the rest of the world. I didn't want to get involved with actually playing, and so did my charitable bit by turning up as the colonel and marching up and down the field barking orders, lying in the goal mouth and just generally making a nuisance of myself. I find football an entirely tedious game anyway. Someone I didn't know till then, he was called Keith Moon, also thought that the game needed a bit more life, and drove a car onto the pitch, grabbed the ball and scored. The game became suitably muddled after that, and we all went to the clubhouse for drinkies. Keith and I seemed to have some kind of instant rapport, and certainly we both liked drink. We played an old St. Swithin's game called Shitties, in which teams compete in trying to deposit 3 coins held between the buttocks into a pint pot placed 10 feet away from the starting line. A few more drinks, and then back to Keith's place. An amazing construction of plate glass and concrete with octaphonic sound in every room, all playing different tracks. A howling dog and a nearly ex-wife locked in a broom cupboard. Here we had more drinks and apologised for having driven over Keith's chauffeur's hat. He reminisced gleefully about a few recent outrages and outlined a change of policy. Instead of destroying repellent hotel rooms, he had decided on a more constructive approach. Every visitor should smuggle in a suitcase full of building materials so that he could build some annoyingly permanent memento like a brick dog kennel in the middle of the room. I left at about 3 or 4 in the morning, Keith providing me with a bottle of scotch for the long journey from Chertsey. Very considerate. I would have done the same for him, and I have. The next time I remember meeting Keith was after a concert at the Sundown in Edmonton, London. Amazing. The balcony oscillated fully 6 inches in the middle, and the walls could be seen vibrating with the wonderful noise of the Who. I found I could actually understand the words if I put my fingers in my ears. I went round backstage afterwards to congratulate Keith. Great! Loved it, I said. I could hear some of the words with my fingers in my ears. Keith laughed, and a diminutive grey-haired old lady said, "Shall I hit him, Keith, or will you?" Keith said, "Oh, you do it." She then swiftly lifted one of her little legs and kicked me in the balls. Fortunately, she just missed these sensitive parts, and I said magnanimously, "Go on, have another go," expecting her to give up. But she didn't, and clipped the lower bit of my left testicle. Wah! I went. Keith apologised for his mother-in-law's behaviour and suggested we should go for a drink. For once I didn't feel like a drink and left, promising to see him again as soon as I felt better. The next time I saw Keith was at the Londonderry Hotel, the only hotel in London which would accept him, and even then his penthouse suite was registered under the name of Rupert Wilde. I called at the Londonderry and asked for Mr. Wilde's suite. It was on the top floor, the 11th, I think, and I arrived to find Keith and a few assorted girls, but no gin and tonic. I filled in with a beer or two while we waited for the gin Keith had immediately ordered from room service on my arrival. 15 minutes later, still no sign of gin. Keith rang room service to tell them that if the gin didn't arrive within the next 5 minutes, their television set would arrive on the pavement. Keith became impatient and disappeared out of the window. I realised that this itself was extraordinary, more than 10 floors up. I looked out of the window expecting to see a balcony, but no, there was no balcony, and no Keith, only a 4-inch wide ledge extending round the building. I wouldn't have gone out there, but then I wasn't Keith. I sat back and waited, sipping at a beer. Then Keith reappeared through the window, carrying a bottle of Beefeater gin, which he plonked on the table, saying, "There you are, Graham." He'd made his way along the ledge and broken into the next-door penthouse suite and stolen the bottle from their drinks cabinet. Keith was never dull. Nobody could ever accuse him of that. And whenever the two of us arrived together in his old local, or my current one, the Angel, there was an air of expectancy. Something was about to happen. He was never predictable, and arrived at the pub one evening while a quiet charity raffle of a cake and a basket of fruit was in progress for Hornsey handicapped children. The enthusiastic bidding was flagging at £1.50 for the fruit. Keith immediately put in a bid of £45 and startled everyone by paying another 50 for the cake. And the people there who had been expecting trouble at the sight of him had to revise their opinions. We then went back to my place for a few drinkies, and a friend of mine from the pub, Dennis, found a naughty lady of the night, and with the aid of Keith's white Rolls-Royce Phantom, brought her to the house. At the point where Keith seemed to be about to eat a butterfly she had tattooed near to her naughty bits, I suddenly decided that it was ice axe time, a mountaineer's primitive way of ejecting unwanted callers, and that everyone should leave. Keith later correctly ascribed this to jealousy, in that everything would have been fine if a suitable young man had been found as well. The Who were doing 3 charity Christmas concerts at the Hammersmith Odeon. Keith asked me if I would help out by filling in between acts. I said yes, and prepared a little bit of nonsense to perform, and had a ridiculous song, Yardie Buckety, written out on a sheet to be lowered down so that the audience could get to sing, relieving some of my burden. No one had come to the theatre to hear my attempts at humour. They wanted The Who. I had a difficult time, and gave up in mid-monologue, and cut to the end of the song and got off. Keith said you were lousy and drunk. I agreed. I had been lousy, but the drunkenness was immaterial. I told him not to worry, and now that I'd got the audience sussed, I'd have something better worked out for the next 2 nights. The next night, I arranged for my microphone to be put through the same amplification system as The Who, and walked out onto the stage and asked the audience for 10 minutes of abuse. They started shouting a few obscenities. Then, through the full amplification, I told them that this was not good enough. I meant real abuse. That was rotten, feeble. I shouted over their now mounting yells of shithead, cunt, etc., and then stood back and looked at my wristwatch, encouraging them occasionally, if their abuse showed any sign of waning in intensity. After 10 minutes was up, I got them to sing the song, and everyone was in the right mood for The Who. I came off stage, and there was Keith grinning. "Fucking great," he said. The third night was no problem either. The most frightening appearance I've ever made was doing a similar job filling in between acts for Pink Floyd and their Nebworth outdoor concert. Walking up onto that stage alone to face 90,000 people was alarming. I include this as an example of the self-aggrandizement posing as humility common to all autobiographies. The film Monty Python and the Holy Grail made a lot of money for me, and for me it was a lot. Unfortunately, the tax people demanded 83% of this, but having a little left, I decided to invest it in something I knew about. Some years before, Bernard McKenna had written a half-hour TV play for Ronnie Barker called The Odd Job. I liked this and thought that it would form the basis for a very funny film. The idea being that a man who had found himself incapable of committing suicide hires an odd job man to do the job for him. Knowing his own weakness, he tells the man not to take any notice should he appear to change his mind or make any attempt to preserve his life. Just bump him off. The odd job man leaves, The central character's reasons for wanting to commit suicide then disappear, with the reappearance of a forgiving wife. But now there is a man out there with a contract on him, whom he has no way of contacting, and who will take no notice of him even if he did. Keith, I thought, would make an excellent odd job man. I commissioned a script from Bernard, and the process of film production began. Eventually, I had a script that I was happy with. Keith and I were to play the leads, and I found sufficient financial backing, about £500,000. The production was on. Now, Keith had a problem with alcohol, just as I had. Indeed, I first began to realize how ill I was becoming, having sat next to Keith's bedside on the occasions when he was suffering, and I mean suffering, from withdrawal symptoms. He had hallucinated that he was losing weight to the extent that he would shortly no longer exist, and had to keep weighing himself for reassurance. He also thought the SAS were after him, and had tied him to the bed for one entire night with wire electrodes either side of his testicles, so that if he shook or moved at all, the shock would be very nasty indeed. It's difficult to remain motionless when you have DTs. This was an horrific experience for him. 2 weeks away from shooting, Keith was in hospital drying out to get fit, ready for the filming. Unfortunately, the director I'd engaged, Cliff Owen, had broken his thigh a week earlier, and we now had a new director, Peter Medak. Feeling lucky to find a director who would be willing to take on the task at such short notice, I took Peter to see Keith in hospital, where we did a little read-through of a couple of scenes. We left the hospital. Peter Medak became convinced that my best friend was not the right person for the job. I felt he was wrong, but there was little I could do about it. My executive producers, they provided a lot of the actual cash, preferred to take Peter's judgment on this issue, despite vigorous protestation from me, directly to Peter's main ally in this, a chap called Steve O'Rourke, manager of the Pink Floyd, to whom I said that I had only begun to be interested in this project from the start because this was exactly the right role for Keith, and that without him the film would just become another British B-feature or worse. Short of cancelling filming altogether, there was nothing I could do. My producers, executive producers, and even author Bernard were all expressing doubts as to Keith's ability. In part, they were worried, I suppose, about his drinking, but damn it, they were wrong. I knew the two of us could see it through. By this time, I'd been off alcohol for 3 months. I had a sleepless night. I knew how much Keith was looking forward to the part in the film. I knew that I was right, and they were wrong. But should I just wave goodbye to £50,000 I'd already spent on making the film, or take a chance on it making money? I chose the latter, and still wish I hadn't. Keith was very understanding about it, but I knew how much it must have hurt him. At the same time, EMI had just backed out of their deal with Python about providing $4 million for the Life of Brian production. Lord Delfont himself gave us the chop, above the heads of the chief of EMI production, who had agreed the terms. Keith set about vigorously trying to raise the money for us to save this venture, and would have succeeded in time, but George Harrison made an extremely courageous offer, which was eagerly accepted by us, and the film was on again. Keith was going to play the part of one of the Blood and Thunder prophets in that, and when I met him a week before we went to start shooting in Tunisia, he seemed to be looking forward to it all very much. He was still not drinking, and had, it seemed, beaten the bottle. But on September the 7th, 1978, he died, having drunk a quantity of wine, some brandy, and taken some heminevrin pills, a drug sometimes used to avert the foulest horrors of alcohol withdrawal. A combination which was deadly. I didn't know how to react. The loss was too appalling to comprehend, but it left me determined to make sure that his spirit, his vision of right and wrong, his energy, would not die with him. Keith was kindness itself, and never harmed anyone in his escapades, which certainly brightened up many lives, just because there was someone around who was reckless enough to say, "Stuff the lot of you," and drive his Rolls-Royce into a swimming pool, or blow the door off a hotel bedroom with dynamite because a pompous hotel manager complained about his cassette recorder making a noise in the lobby. The amazed manager, staring at the smoking doorway as Keith pointed at his cassette still playing, was told, "That is noise, mate. This is The Who." Keith is one person I know I'll see again. Now, as luck and Captain W.E. Johns would have it, everything went Air Force blue with flashes of gold. We hurtled towards the safe pericentre of the black hole of Orion, employing occasional plasma ramjet thrusts to avoid a clutch of indescribable singularities, arriving light years away, but simultaneously in Los Angeles 2 years later. I had slipped into a state of inertia. All further activity seemed pointless. I had fallen foul of one of my own footnotes. For months now I'd been suffering from this ill-defined mental malaise. Nothing seemed real anymore. Was this just the effect of living in Los Angeles, in which case I should leave immediately, or was there some deeper psychopathology? I called Dr. Wanacross to examine me. As we sipped our apricot Shastas, we chatted amiably about how it was now 2 years since our encounter in Chapter 0. He was pleased that I had successfully kicked the habit of 23/37ths of a lifetime, but again gave analytical flummery the elbow and said, "Do you realize that in the 10 minutes I've been here you've dropped 17 famous names?" "Have I said. "I didn't intend to. It's just that I happen to know these people. They're friends of mine. They live here." "I want you to repeat what you just said to yourself and think about it as a medical man." "You mean I've got—" My head reeled as the grim reality struck me like a blow on the head from a copy of Cecil and Loeb. "Yes, Nivenism," he said. "It's a common enough complication of angelitis, a similar disease to that described by Freud as the Frank Harris syndrome, an endemic autobiographical complaint. What should I do, move to Finland? No, you must face the problem. There is no known treatment. You'll just have to sweat it out." "Isn't there anything I can do to speed up my recovery?" "There is, but it isn't going to be pleasant, I'm afraid. Revulsion therapy. I'm going to prescribe to you an intensive course of Hollywood parties. It's your only hope." Chapter 13. The mood is a full baboon. It was 12:30. A 900,081cc Harley-Davidson Mitsubishi Cranston Thurbid, black leather-bound, steel-studded City of Angels bike iron-throated its way up the Pauntley Drive of 204 Bristol Avenue, South Brentwood, L.A., California. "Shit," drawled David. "That's Peter." Being laid back, obligatory in Southern California, I allowed the customary 20-minute pause to elapse before responding with, "'Pon my soul, 'tis." We allowed another 20 minutes of laid-back time to pass before expecting to hear the doorbell. Zzz, it clanged. Both parties either side of the door alpha-rhythmed away a further third of an hour. Finally, after a series of languid phone calls, we managed to get through to Starlight Emergency 24-hour luxury door-opening service. We'd used them before. They were a good firm, and for a pittance of $1,000 a week, would arrive within minutes to open anyone's doors. There was, of course, a $50 surcharge for not being in the Beverly Hills area, but in addition to their activities with portals, they would remove any unwanted single-portion pizzas under 1 meter in width. David gave them a Mexican gardener as a tip and showed Peter in. Peter Bromilo, 6 feet 12 inches of mock neo-Nazi garbed SS rough trade chic, strode into the room and politely asked to be shown the cucumbers in a manner reminiscent of Henry Irving at Agincourt. "Now grit the teeth and wet the microtome. If tea party there be, let cucumber be slivered to the thinnest with precision, and pressed twixt finest slices of good bread." Exits left into kitchen. Starfeast 24-hour caterpersons were not allowed to interfere with their grotesque Californian ways in the preparation of this most English of occasions. The therapy was underway. In the kitchen, bread was already being thinly sliced with the sharpest of knives, dipped in 211 Fahrenheitist water by Deitch Helmer, a Russian Jewish princess and session-singing, side-saddle-riding veterinarian's assistant, while in another corner of the room a grinning, momentarily apostate tunesmith son of Sid Charisse was mixing some elixir grimdarkii, its influence pervading the very atmosphere. Zzz! Rustled the doorbell, heralding the arrival and swift starlight-assisted admittance of Barbara and Dr. Timothy Leary. The blissful couple appeared to have attained glitnia, Yimusvara, call it what you will, but they had definitely uncoiled Kundalini right up past their Sahasraras. They had eschewed years of meditation in lotus posture, tedious attempts at withdrawing attention from perceptual cognition, and weeks of leafing through back numbers of Self-Realization magazine, and had achieved the same Elysian state by the use of chemical additives. As the couple glid past, Timothy's blue-grey eyes gazed with radium-like lustre into something that might well be described as eternity. Their 3 children, seeing something they wanted in the garden, stampeded earthily over the grand piano, through a token bevy of uninvited journalists, across the lawn, leapt over the recumbent naked form of a friend of David Hockney, and straight into the pool fully clothed. "Isn't that George Lazenby over there, enjoying a can of specially imported Foster's lager?" "What, Do you mean behind Christopher Isherwood and Georgia Brown, seen there enjoying a joke with Ian Lafrene?" queried the second token journalist. "Yes, between Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, Bo Diddley and the piano, seen over there enjoying a brief rest in a tight schedule. Who's that with Hollywood psychiatrist Dr. Stuart Lerner? It could be either Jane Seymour, Jenny Aguta, Susan George, Shelley Duvall, or Victor Borger." "Victor Borger? Sorry, did I say Victor Borger? Only I also thought I caught sight of Victor Borger enjoying a quiet word with Charlton Chuck Heston and screenwriter companion Alan Katz." "Yes, but who's that girl with Stuart Lerner?" "Ah, that's Sylvia Christel." "Oh." The sun dappled its way through the trees, spilling onto the crisp white linen of the tea-table which ran the full length of the garden. Cucumber sandwiches were passed. Tea was poured from silver pots into bone china, and the soft clop of croquet mallet-hitting ball wafted across the lawn. A token journalist 4 yards away thought the party was in full swing, and I could hear the distant drone of Bernard McKenna throwing up after his second bottle of bourbon. Thank heavens we had given him his own quarters. Everyone seems to be occupied, I thought, as I slipped through the guests, nodded to Burt Reynolds' chauffeur, and stepped discreetly through a side door into the waiting presidential limo. Now for Phase 2. It was, coincidentally, David Frost's 40th birthday party, his third that afternoon, and I'd promised to try and look in for a moment or two. I'm glad I did, for there, in the main ballroom, seated at the top table, completely surrounded by journalists, was David Paradine Frost. David was so preoccupied that he was unaware that table upon table of celebrities to grace this magnificent occasion had sent along cardboard cutouts of themselves. There sat an effigy of Peter Sellers. At another table, a photograph of James Coburn chatted to an image of Dick Van Dyke. Between them, one could see the outline of Andy Williams standing in for a silhouette of Ray Stevens. Mary Tyler Moore, Jane Fonda, Gabe Kaplan, Victor Borger, and David Niven had arrived as a group shot, and David thanked a two-dimensional Henry Kissinger for his thoughtful gift of 24 fresh sycophants, and even more effusively thanked one of his secretaries for having had the absolutely superbly fantastic and original idea of inviting his mother along. Then, almost as if on cue, a singing telegram arrived. A refugee from a Busby Berkeley musical mawked her way through a cloying paean of praise for David's unique achievement. This was followed by a dancing telegram, followed by a dancing and singing telegram, then a dancing-singing telegram on roller skates dressed like a birthday cake. David even managed to feign surprise when a fifth telegram, a roller-skating, shouting, singing comedy duo, arrived. For once, David had made a slight miscalculation. Even his synthesized smile showed signs of sagging, fortunately perking up professionally for each photographic flash. Luckily, Peter Sellers' cardboard cutout had lost interest in the proceedings, and I was able to make my exit hiding behind it as it excused itself on the grounds of ill health. It had apparently been bitten on the shin by a tiger whilst skiing. On the way out, I consoled an agitated Rod Stewart, who unfortunately had had to come to the party in person. He'd only got married that morning, and the blow-ups of the happy couple could not be processed in time. A Carmen Mirandettal host person with eerily nude legs assisted me to my seat in the Starminder Sit-'em Easy limo loader. As I was glidden hydraulically to my seat in the presidential limo, through the darkened glass I caught a glimpse of Peter's cutout being loaded with intensive care into a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud Fantambulance. I pressed the audio off switch on the colour TV and settled back to listen to Dr. Bowie's Kooks on the car's septemphonic sound system, took a can of Diet Loganberry Shasta from the bar and sipped at it between puffs of a J of Antarctic beige, nibbling sporadically from a plastic bag full of mushrooms. As we fluoresced our way westward along Sunset past a shimmering Chateau Marmont, another limo glowed alongside. Its sunroof slid back, and a figure stood up to wave cheerily at some ladies with long legs standing outside the body shop. It was Eric Idle. I pressed the raise button on my armrest and went up to the sun deck position. Eric had disappeared inside. I told the driver to get me his number and picked up the handset. Seconds later, I heard the phone ring in the next-door car. After the usual pleasantries of "Hello, Eric," "Hello, Graham," "What are you on?" had been exchanged, he and Ricky Fatang and Penelope Elm crossed over on their limo loader. "Would you all like to come to a party at my place later on?" I asked, as I passed round a brown paper bag filled with cookies and poured them large vodkas on the rocks. "I think we're already at one," replied Eric. "George said he'd try and drop by, and I know Harry and Richard are going to be there." "All right, see you later," said Eric. "It's okay if we bring Keith and Ron, isn't it?" "Sure, okay, see you later. I'm just going to nip off down through Boys Town on the way back. I want to pick up some Zoom." "I bet that's not all," twinkled Eric. It was dark as I and a few guests I'd found en route at a party in the Polo Lounge arrived back at 203 Bristol Avenue North. A young Texan, an Irish choir boy, and a Thai busboy called Bum were not among them. Van Dyke Parks greeted me with, "We all love your style, Graham, and to me that's as important as ducks in June." I agreed wholeheartedly and went into the main room. It must have been something I'd eaten. The house seemed to be full of an assemblage of images, sounds and smells and other sensations, mediated through a spot 2 inches behind the nape of my neck and all the way up the inside of my trousers. I stared at people, hoping that they wouldn't notice how strange they looked to me. Normally this didn't bother me. I'd probably been smoking too much. Harry Nilsson was at the piano performing a duet with a barking robot dog. Ringo then led a rendition of Happy Birthday to You, accompanied by 25 lead vocalists who just happened to be there, and countless session singers, a gift from Warner Brothers. Harry and Marty Feldman added a touch of Keith Moon by using the top of the piano as a drum kit. My mother and father hovered in a state of enlightened astonishment at having found yet another black man who was very well spoken, you know. Taking a cue from Marty, who was by now chasing Hollywood psychiatrist Stuart Lerner around the room trying to embarrass him with a French kiss, I chatted up the nearest sex symbol, Sylvia Christel, telling her to pop in and see Bernard McKenna, who I felt needed a sexual threat to slow down his rapidly developing affair with a gallon of bourbon. She returned a few minutes later, her advances having been repelled by an in-flight ashtray. She wandered off into the garden to be consoled by a girlfriend. Tony Stratton Smith, 1st Earl of Lambourne elect, schoonered past beatifically, murmuring ventriloquially, "Ah, Brazil, ah, Brazil, ah, Brazil." George Harrison, an island of purity, glowed nearby with a "Hello, Graham" and a self-realization fellowship wave. My mother didn't think that Ron Woods and Keith Richards should have been allowed into my bedroom, since they were Eric's guests, and she was very worried about whether those 2 girls were all right out there in the bushes. I let her worry away happily. Loretta Feldman told a bemused Eric how full of shit people could be in an explanatory bellow. Elton John appeared without his cap and spectacles, a bubbling, liberated, portly soul. Image followed image until early morning. The house was almost empty, but the drumming at the piano had resumed and continued till near dawn when Marty and Loretta left, leaving Harry, who couldn't understand people's lack of stamina, and called me a shit as I saw him firmly into his limo. "Yes, I am," seemed the appropriate reply. Out there at 6:30 a.m. he screamed at the top of his voice in the direction of Hollywood, exclaiming that it too was full of shit. I bellowed in agreement with my friend as his limo thuffed off down the drive towards the rising sun. Dr. Wanacross gave me a conspiratorial thumbs-up from the bushes. Thankfully, I closed the door, and Star-to-Bed, tuckers into the stars, no kids or animals, saw me to bed, not forgetting to clean my teeth. I fell asleep as a girl with brown knees finished Chapter 9 of Biggles Grits His Thighs. "The moon," yawned Algy opiningly, "is rather a dull place," and all of us decided that we would definitely leave the following Tuesday. Even at 1/6G, the pogo sticks had become a bore. The daily round of long-distance TV chat shows, panel games about extraterrestrial things, guest appearances on This Is Your Planet, all of which conveniently defy description, became about as interesting as breakfast at Tiffany's. It was Sunday afternoon, and the pubs were all shut. After an hour of sexual reminiscences about things none of us had ever done, we decided to have a farewell party. David made the cucumber sandwiches, John prepared James Grimsdyke's famous punch, and I slipped out in my beige spacesuit to see if the others would be prepared to pop along. The Beast and Anna Karenina were doing the hoovering. John Cleese's diary was absolutely chock-a-block, and Nostradamus had left a note on the door of his capsule saying, "I predict I'll be back about 8. I was about to give up, but thought, without much hope, I may as well call in on the Alleys. Mrs. Alley was regurgitating masticated carrots into the champ's mouth as he was being rubbed down by his old space partner. "Can you come to our party?" I asked. "Man, I'd love to," he said, "but no, I can't." "Sorry about that," I said. "But why not? Look, I've spent 12 years building up this reputation of being a loud-mouthed butt nigger. Do you want me to spoil that by coming round to your place and being as intelligent as I really am?" "Yes, I suppose that would blow your cover a bit, old man," I said. "You bet, man." I stepped out nimbly through the airlock and deftly percolated past Elton John's piano-shaped moon buggy. He was obviously entertaining David Bowie and Ken Liberace, so I passed on. I knew the next space vehicle was occupied for an at-home evening by David Hockney and Alan Bennett, comparing the size of their accents, so I didn't bother with them. I then molested my way past J.B. Priestley, H.R.H. the Queen Mother, David Niven, please note, Peter Sellers, Britt Eklund, Carlo Ponti, Peter Cook, and Bo Dudley, but not the Dr. Jonathan Miller, H.R.H. the very dead Governor of New Zealand, Noel Coward, George Melly, and Larry and Jerry Durrell. Unfortunately, they all had slight chills that evening. Keith Moon, Richard Starkey, and Harry Nilsson were genuinely disappointed that they couldn't come, in that they weren't in the lunar regions at that time, but wished us all well. In desperation, I knocked on the hatch of a capsule made entirely of wood. There was no reply. I undid the mahogany latch on the huge teak door and approached the coffin. Engraved in the oak were the words, "Here lies Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wilde, gone out for good." I'd had enough excuses for one day. I wrenched open the Lombardy poplar lid with a noise resembling a loud rustle, which means nothing on earth, but in outer space can often split your nose. I took hold of the dead wit's legs and dragged him back to my place. There is a time in the affairs of Grebes which, taken at the cludge, leads on to brutalness. A man is not a wasp, nor Dusseldorf built in a day. Damon Runyon had a bunion, and for awe they say, hey I. My heart bakes, a drowsy numbness fills my Jensen. Let it be, let it be. "What's that supposed to mean?" asked David. "It's not bad. He is dead," I said. "Oh, come on. He's dead. It's not bad." "No, come on, Wilde. What does that mean?" asked the Prince of Wales. "It means, Your Majesty, it means—" The audience exploded into laughter. We all ran off stage, and John Cleese hissed angrily into my ear, "Learn your fucking lines. It should have been—" "You had us waiting for hours." Graham, faintly. "I didn't think anyone noticed." John, even more faintly. "No, I suppose they didn't." Graham, and still more faintly. The end.